The gas lamps along the embankment had gone dark 3 hours before anyone noticed. Not because the lamplighters had forgotten, because they had been told. When Lucian Ravenscar moved through London at night, he preferred the city blind. His carriage cut through the fog like a blade drawn slow across skin, iron wheels grinding against wet cobblestones while the Thames churned black and rotten 50 feet below. Inside, the Duke of Blackthorn sat with his gloved hands resting on the silver head of a walking cane he had never once used for walking. His jaw was set. His pale blue eyes reflected nothing. He looked like a man carved from the same cold stone as the palace that bore his name. And tonight he was returning from a meeting where 3 men had begged for their lives and only one had received permission to keep his. The footman opened the carriage door without a word. Rain hit Lucien's shoulders. He did not flinch. He never flinched. Flinching was a language spoken by men who had not yet learned that the world would eat them alive the moment they revealed where it hurt. Blackthorn Palace swallowed him whole. The entrance hall stretched 60 feet high, vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, portraits of dead Ravenscars lining walls so thick they had once repelled cannon fire during the Civil Wars. Lucien's boots echoed against marble floors polished to a murderous shine. Servants materialized and vanished like ghosts trained to exist only when useful. No one spoke. No one ever spoke first inside these walls. That privilege belonged to one man alone. Lucian climbed the grand staircase without removing his coat. Water dripped from the wool and stained the carpet behind him. He passed the library where his father had once read poetry aloud to his mother on winter evenings, back when the Ravenscar name still carried warmth. He did not look inside. He had sealed that room 11 years ago, the night they buried what remained of Lord Aldrich Ravenscar, in a coffin so light it might have been empty. At the far end of the east corridor, Lucian entered his private study. A fire burned low in the grate. Maps of northern England covered the walls, each one annotated in his handwriting with rail lines, factory locations, coal deposits, and the names of men who owed him debts they could never repay. He poured whiskey into a glass and drank it standing, staring at the rain streaking down windows that overlooked a city he intended to own completely before he died. His valet, Hargrove, appeared at the door. The old man had served Blackthorn for 40 years. He was the only living person permitted to enter this room uninvited. Lord Pemberton's man delivered a letter this evening, Your Grace. Burn it. He says the matter concerns Lady Seraphina Vale. Lucien's hand stopped halfway to the decanter. The stillness lasted only a second, but Hargrove had worked for the Ravenscars long enough to recognize what silence meant when it came from this particular duke. It meant something had shifted behind those frozen eyes. Something with teeth. Leave the letter on the desk. Icky. Hargrove placed the envelope on the mahogany surface and disappeared. Lucian did not touch it immediately. He finished his whiskey. He removed his gloves, one finger at a time, and laid them across the arm of his chair. Then he broke the seal with his thumbnail and read the contents twice. The letter was short. Pemberton's language was careful, diplomatic, full of the kind of polished cowardice that powerful men used when they wanted to deliver a threat without leaving fingerprints. The message beneath the pleasantries was simple. Lady Seraphina Vale had returned to London. She had been seen attending salons hosted by reformist politicians. She had been asking questions about Blackthorn's northern operations, and certain parties within Parliament believed she represented a very specific kind of danger to the Duke's interests. Lucian folded the letter and fed it to the fire. He watched it burn until nothing remained but ash. Then he said a name so quietly, even the flame seemed to lean closer to hear it. Seraphinos. He had heard the name before. Everyone in London had. The Vale family had once stood among the most respected houses in England until her father, Lord Marcus Vale, had been destroyed in a political scandal so vicious it had erased the family from society overnight. Accusations of treason, forged evidence, a trial conducted behind closed doors by men who had already decided the verdict before the first witness spoke. Marcus Vale died in prison 18 months later. His wife followed him into the ground within the year. Their daughter vanished from England entirely, and for a decade, no one spoke her name in polite company. Now she was back, and asking questions about him. Lucian poured another whiskey and sat down in the leather chair beside the fire. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple and closed his eyes. The headaches had been worsening for months, ever since the northern strikes had forced him to shut down 3 factories and send soldiers to restore order. 60 workers arrested, 12 hospitalized. One dead, though the official report blamed a collapsed beam rather than a rifle butt to the skull. Lucian had read the real report. He had filed it in the same drawer where he kept every ugly truth his empire produced, because a man who refused to look at his own darkness was a man waiting to be ambushed by it. The clock on the mantel struck 2 in the morning. Lucien opened his eyes and stared at the fire. "Find me everything," he said to the empty room, knowing Hargrove was listening from the corridor. "Every document, every rumor, every connection she has made since arriving in London. I want to know who funds her, who shelters her, who she speaks to when she believes no one is watching." A pause. "And Hargrove, Your Grace, if Pemberton contacts this house again, inform him that I do not accept correspondence from men who lack the courage to deliver their own threats." The silence that followed was confirmation enough. 3 days later, Lucian attended the Marchioness of Ashworth's annual autumn ball. He despised these events with a thoroughness that bordered on religion. The perfume, the laughter, the desperate social mathematics performed by every person in the room, calculating who could be useful and who could be discarded. He understood the machinery because he had mastered it long ago, but mastery and enjoyment were different animals entirely. He stood near the east wall of the ballroom with a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking. His black evening coat fit like armor. His expression carried the warmth of a closed vault. Around him, the aristocracy performed its nightly ritual of mutual destruction disguised as civility. Lord Ashton approached first, a banking magnate with soft hands and a voice calibrated to flatter. "Ravenscar, you honor us. I had feared the northern business might keep you from the season entirely, son." "The North manages itself, Ashton. I came to London because certain people have forgotten what happens when they manage things without my permission." Ashton's smile thinned but held. "Always direct. I admire that about you." "No, you don't. You find it terrifying. That is why you approached me first tonight, so no one could say you were avoiding me." Ashton blinked. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He excused himself with a bow so deep it bordered on genuflection. Lucien watched him retreat into the crowd. Pathetic. Every last one of them. Grown men wearing their ambitions like cologne, too thick and too obvious, filling every room with the stink of their hunger. He had been raised among these people. He had watched them smile at his father while plotting his destruction. He had stood beside his mother's bed while she died from a poison no doctor could name, because the men who administered it had purchased the silence of every physician in London. These memories did not make Lucian angry. They made him precise. Anger was wasteful. Precision was eternal. He was preparing to leave when he saw her. She stood near the marble staircase at the far end of the ballroom, half illuminated by candlelight, wearing a silver gown that caught the light like water frozen in motion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that rejected the elaborate fashions surrounding her. No excessive jewels, no peacock feathers, no desperate ornamentation screaming for attention. She held a glass of wine she had clearly been nursing for the better part of an hour, and she was watching the room with the calm, calculating stillness of someone who had learned to read people the way soldiers read terrain. Lady Seraphina Vale. Lucien studied her the way he studied balance sheets, methodically, without sentiment. She was beautiful, but beauty was common among the aristocracy, and he had never found it particularly interesting on its own. What stopped him was something else entirely. Something in the architecture of her stillness. She was not performing composure. She was not suppressing fear. She was genuinely unbothered by the most powerful gathering in England, and that kind of calm could not be faked. It had to be forged. He wanted to know what had forged it. Their eyes met across the ballroom. She did not look away. In Lucien's experience, people looked away. Ministers, generals, bankers who controlled fortunes larger than some nations. They all eventually dropped their gaze when he held it long enough. It was instinct. The same instinct that made lesser animals bare their throats when a predator stood too close. Survival demanded submission, and Lucien had spent his entire adult life cultivating the kind of presence that triggered that response without effort. Seraphina Vale met his stare and held it with the quiet defiance of someone who had already survived the worst the world could deliver and found it insufficient to break her. Something shifted in Lucien's chest. He did not like it. He crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted without being asked. They always did. He reached the staircase and stood close enough to smell her perfume, something faint and sharp, like winter air over open water. "Lady Vale." Duke Ravenscar's. Her voice carried no tremor, no deference. She spoke his title the way one might name a geographical feature. Factual. Unimpressed. "You have been asking questions about my northern operations," he said. "I have been asking questions about many things. Your operations happen to intersect with several of them. That is a diplomatic way of saying you have been investigating me. Investigation implies suspicion. I prefer to call it curiosity. Curiosity about a man like me tends to have consequences. So does ignorance." She took a sip of wine. Her eyes never left his. "I spent 10 years in exile because my father trusted men who smiled at him while sharpening their knives. I do not intend to repeat his mistakes. Your father's mistakes were not about trust. They were about weakness. He trusted the wrong people because he lacked the power to make them irrelevant." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not pain, something hotter. "You speak very confidently about a man you never met. I knew men like him. They believed the system would protect them because they had served it faithfully. They were wrong. The system protects no one. It consumes. And you? What protects you?" Lucian smiled. It was not a warm expression. "I do not require protection, Lady Vale. I am the thing others need protection from." She studied him for a long moment. The ballroom noise seemed to recede around them, violins and laughter fading into irrelevance. "That must be very lonely," she said. The words hit him like a blade slipped between ribs. Not because they were cruel, because they were accurate. And accuracy, in Lucien's world, was the most dangerous weapon anyone could wield. He said nothing. Serafina set her wine glass on the banister and inclined her head. "Good evening, Duke Ravenscar. I suspect we will be seeing a great deal of each other." She turned and walked down the staircase without waiting for his response. Lucien watched her disappear into the crowd below. His hand tightened around the champagne glass until the crystal cracked. Over the following weeks, London society buzzed with speculation. Lady Serafina Vale attended every significant gathering of the season, and at each one she demonstrated a gift for political navigation that unsettled men twice her age. She did not flatter. She did not seduce. She listened with surgical precision and then asked questions that exposed the rotting foundations beneath carefully constructed arguments. At Lord Pemberton's dinner party, she dismantled his proposal for Northern labor reform in 6 sentences, revealing that the legislation would quietly transfer regulatory authority to companies Pemberton's family controlled. At the Duchess of Kenworth's salon, she cornered the Home Secretary's aide and extracted an admission that the government had suppressed 3 separate reports on factory conditions in Blackthorn's territories. And at the Bankers' Guild reception, she sat across from Cedric Waverley, Duke of Ashford, and smiled at him so beautifully that he failed to notice she had spent the entire evening mapping his financial alliances with the precision of a military cartographer. Reports of her activities reached Lucien daily. His network of informants was vast, paid eyes and ears embedded in every household, every club, every corridor of power in the city. He read each report in his study late at night, whiskey in hand, firelight throwing shadows across his face. She was magnificent, and she was getting dangerously close to information that could destabilize his empire. He summoned her to Blackthorn Palace on a Tuesday evening, sending his personal carriage with a handwritten note that contained exactly 4 words. "We need to talk." Serafina arrived at 8 o'clock. She wore a dark blue dress with no adornment, and she entered the palace the way a general enters hostile territory, alert, composed, and unwilling to show surprise at anything she encountered. Hargrove escorted her to the private dining room on the 2nd floor. The table was set for 2. Candles burned in silver holders. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Lucien stood beside the window with his back to her, looking out at the London skyline smeared with rain. He did not turn when she entered. "Sit. I am not one of your employees, Ravenscar. Guillaume, you do not command me." He turned then, slowly, and the look on his face was something between amusement and warning. "You are correct. I do not command you. I am asking. Sit, please." The please sounded like it cost him something. Serafina sat. Dinner was served in silence by servants who appeared and vanished with practiced invisibility. Roasted pheasant, root vegetables glazed in butter, wine from Blackthorn's private vineyards in France. Lucien ate methodically, as he did everything, without excess or performance. Serafina matched his pace. Neither spoke until the plates were cleared and the servants withdrew. Then Lucien leaned back in his chair and fixed her with those cold blue eyes. "You have been busy." "I have been thorough. There is a difference. You exposed Pemberton's labor scheme. You extracted classified information from the Home Secretary's office. You mapped Waverly's financial network in a single evening. These are not the activities of a woman satisfying idle curiosity." "No," she agreed. "They are the activities of a woman who understands that information is the only currency that cannot be devalued. Information is also the fastest way to get killed in this city. I'm already supposed to be dead, Ravenscar. My family was erased. My father's name was turned into a cautionary tale. I spent a decade in foreign capitals learning exactly how power operates when it believes no one is watching. Do you think I came back to London to attend balls and find a husband? Then why did you come back?" "Because someone destroyed my family, and I intend to find out who, Bod." The firelight shifted across her face. In that moment, Lucien saw something he recognized with perfect, unsettling clarity. He saw his own reflection, the same cold fury, the same bottomless patience, the same willingness to spend years, decades if necessary, constructing the architecture of revenge. He poured wine for both of them. "The men who destroyed your father are the same men who destroyed mine," he said quietly. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Serafina's composure cracked for the first time. A fracture so small most people would have missed it, but Lucien was not most people. He noticed the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, the way her breath caught for half a second before she controlled it. "Explain," she said. Lucien stood and walked to the fireplace. He rested one hand on the mantel and stared into the flames. "My father, Lord Aldrich Ravenscar, was a good man. That was his fatal flaw. He believed in the system. He served the crown faithfully. He built schools in the north. He improved conditions in the factories. He treated his workers like human beings rather than machinery. And for that, the men who profited from human suffering decided he needed to be removed." He paused. The fire popped and hissed. They began with his reputation, forged documents suggesting financial misconduct, whispered accusations of disloyalty to the crown. Then they moved to his alliances. One by one, his political allies were threatened, bribed, or blackmailed into abandoning him. Within 2 years, the most respected nobleman in the north had become a pariah. "And your mother?" Lucien's jaw tightened. "My mother was collateral damage. She trusted a physician recommended by Lord Pemberton's wife. The physician prescribed a tonic for her headaches. The tonic contained trace amounts of arsenic, not enough to kill quickly, just enough to destroy her slowly over 18 months, while everyone around her attributed her decline to grief." "You know this for certain." "I had the tonic analyzed by 3 independent chemists after she died. I kept the results. I keep everything." Serafina stared at him. "Why haven't you destroyed them?" "Because destroying them quickly would have been satisfying but incomplete. I want to own them first. Every factory, every rail line, every investment, every debt. I want to control so much of their world that when I finally decide to crush them, there will be nowhere left to run and no one willing to help them." That is not justice. That is obsession. Justice is a word invented by the powerful to convince the weak that suffering has meaning. I do not deal in meaning, Lady Vale. I deal in outcomes. She was quiet for a long time. The fire burned. The rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere in the palace, a clock chimed midnight. "The men who destroyed your father," she said slowly, "were they the same men who testified against mine?" "Some of them. Pemberton sat on the committee that convicted your father. Waverly provided the forged evidence. And the man who coordinated the entire operation was Sir Reginald Hatch, the same man who later recommended my mother's physician." The color drained from Serafina's face, not from fear, from the sudden, devastating realization that the tragedy she had spent 10 years trying to understand was not random cruelty. It was architecture, deliberate, systematic, and connected to a network of destruction far larger than one disgraced family. "They have been doing this for decades," she whispered. Longer. Hatch and his circle have controlled the flow of power in England for 30 years. They do not hold office. They do not seek titles. They operate behind the machinery of government like parasites feeding on the host. Anyone who threatens their profits or their control is eliminated. Your father, mine, dozens of others. The method changes. The result does not. And you have been building your empire specifically to destroy them. Every factory I purchase, every rail line I control, every politician I place in my debt, every piece of land, every contract, every alliance, all of it serves a single purpose. When the time comes, I will own so much of what they depend on that their destruction will not require violence. It will only require me to stop. Stop what? Everything. Their supply chains, their financing, their political cover, their ability to feed themselves. I will turn the machinery of their own greed into the weapon that devours them. Serafina leaned back in her chair and studied him with new eyes. Not the eyes of a woman impressed by power, the eyes of a woman recalculating every assumption she had made. You are not a duke, she said. You are a siege engine wearing a title. Something that was almost a smile crossed Lucien's face. That is the most accurate thing anyone has said about me in years. Then why are you telling me this? You gain nothing by revealing your strategy to someone you barely know. Lucien turned from the fire and looked at her directly. The candlelight caught the scar that ran along his left jawline, a souvenir from a knife fight in a Liverpool dockyard when he was 19 and still learning that the world responded to force faster than it responded to reason. Because you are already inside the machine, Lady Vale. You have been investigating the same men. You have been mapping the same networks. And based on what my people tell me, you're approximately 3 weeks away from asking a question that will get you killed. Which question? The one about where Hatch's money actually comes from. Serafina went very still. You were going to ask it, weren't you? I had a meeting scheduled with a clerk at the Treasury next week. Cancel it. The last person who asked that question was a journalist named Edward Cross. They found his body in the Thames 4 days later. The coroner ruled it a drowning. Cross could swim. The room fell silent. Lucien sat down across from her again. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward. I'm not asking you to trust me. Trust is a luxury neither of us can afford. I am offering you something more valuable. Access. My network. My resources. My protection. In exchange, I want your intelligence, your connections in the reform movement, and your willingness to do what is necessary when the time comes. What is necessary? Whatever it takes to bring them down, all of them, permanently. And if I refuse, then you walk out that door and return to investigating alone. I will not stop you, but I will not protect you either, and the men you are hunting will find you long before you find them. Serafina stared at him across the candlelit table. The firelight painted shadows across both their faces, and for a moment they looked like two creatures forged in the same furnace, scarred by the same hands, driven by the same relentless, bone-deep refusal to let the people who had broken their worlds escape unpunished. This is not an alliance, she said. This is mutually assured destruction with better table manners. Welcome to Blackthorn, Lady Vale. She did not smile, but she did not leave. That was the night the storm began. Over the next month, Serafina moved into the east wing of Blackthorn Palace. The arrangement was presented to society as charitable patronage, a duke extending hospitality to the orphaned daughter of a fallen house. No one believed it. The gossip columns speculated savagely. Cartoonists drew caricatures of Lucien leading Serafina on a leash. Rival nobles whispered that the Iron Duke had finally found a weakness. They were wrong. But the truth was more dangerous than any rumor. Inside the palace walls, Lucien and Serafina constructed a war room. Maps of political connections covered the study walls. Financial records were cross-referenced with parliamentary voting patterns. Informant reports were cataloged and analyzed with the rigor of a military intelligence operation. They worked together every evening after the servants retired. Lucien would stand at the map wall marking connections in red ink, while Serafina sat at the desk dissecting financial documents with terrifying speed. Their conversations were intense, combative, and devoid of the polite fictions that governed every other interaction in their world. Your numbers on Waverly's mining investments are wrong, Serafina said one night, not looking up from a ledger. They're not wrong. They're based on quarterly filings submitted to the Board of Trade, which Waverly falsifies every quarter, cross-reference against the shipping manifest from Newcastle. The tonnage does not match. He is reporting half the actual output, which means he is hiding profits somewhere the government cannot tax them. Lucian stopped writing. He turned and looked at her. How did you obtain Newcastle shipping manifests? Yet. By a bounty. I had dinner with the harbor master's wife 3 weeks ago. Lovely woman. Talks too much when she drinks sherry. You cultivated a source inside the Newcastle Port Authority. I cultivated a friend who happens to have a husband with access to interesting paperwork. There is a difference. Lucian stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something Hargrove would later describe to the kitchen staff as unprecedented in 20 years of service. He laughed. It was a short, rough sound, more surprise than amusement, like a machine that had forgotten it contained moving parts. Serafina looked up from the ledger with an expression of genuine startlement. I did not realize you were capable of that, she said. Neither did I. They held each other's gaze for 3 seconds longer than either intended. Then Lucien turned back to the map, and Serafina returned to the ledger, and neither acknowledged what had just passed between them. But something had shifted, a crack in the architecture, a fissure in walls built to withstand anything. The weeks that followed tested those walls constantly. They argued over strategy with a ferocity that sent servants fleeing from adjacent rooms. Serafina accused Lucien of treating people as chess pieces. Lucien accused Serafina of letting sentiment compromise tactical judgment. She threw an inkwell at his head during a disagreement about whether to expose Pemberton's corruption immediately or wait for a more strategically advantageous moment. The inkwell missed his face by 2 inches and shattered against a portrait of his grandfather. Lucien looked at the ink dripping down the painting. Then he looked at Serafina. Your aim is terrible. I was not aiming at you, I was aiming at the painting. Your grandfather's expression irritates me. He irritated everyone. That is how he acquired 3 counties and a private army. I'm beginning to understand the family resemblance. These exchanges became the rhythm of their partnership. Brutal honesty wrapped in sharp wit, served without apology. Lucien had never experienced anything like it. Every other relationship in his life operated on a transaction basis. Loyalty purchased with money, obedience enforced through fear, cooperation secured through mutual self-interest. But Serafina refused to be transactional. She challenged him because she genuinely believed he was wrong, not because she wanted something. She pushed back against his coldest decisions because she saw the human cost he had trained himself to ignore. And slowly, against every instinct that had kept him alive, Lucien began to listen. Not because she was right, sometimes she was wrong, but because the act of being challenged by someone who was not afraid of him opened something in his mind that had been sealed shut since childhood. A door to a room where different kinds of thinking were possible, where strength did not require absolute control, where power could coexist with something other than isolation. He hated it. He craved it. He could not stop it. One evening in late November, Lucien found Serafina in the palace library. She had discovered the sealed room. The door stood open for the first time in 11 years. She sat in the armchair where his mother used to read, holding a volume of poetry that still smelled faintly of the perfume Lady Ravenscar had worn. Lucien stopped in the doorway. His face became something terrible. Not angry. Worse. Empty. Like a man staring at his own grave. Get out, he said. Lucien, get out of that room. Your mother kept notes in the margins. Serafina held up the book. Her voice was gentle in a way he had never heard from her. She wrote your name beside a passage about wildflowers growing through stone. She wrote, my boy will be stronger than all of them. I said, get out. She was right. She was dead. Being right did not save her. Being good did not save her. Being loved did not save my father. Nothing saved them. Nothing saves anyone. The only thing that matters is being too powerful to destroy, and you are sitting in the room where I learned that lesson, so get out before I say something I cannot take back. Serafina closed the book. She stood. She walked to the doorway where he stood rigid as iron, his hands trembling at his sides in a way she had never seen. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body, close enough to see the wetness gathering in eyes that had not cried since he was 14 years old. "Your mother was right," she said again quietly. "You are stronger than all of them, but strength that cannot bend eventually shatters." She walked past him down the corridor. Lucian stood in the doorway of the library for 27 minutes. He did not enter the room. He did not close the door. He stood in the threshold between the past and the present, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not know which direction to move. Hargrove found him there near midnight and said nothing. He simply brought a glass of whiskey, set it on the hall table, and retreated. The glass was empty by morning. The door remained open. December brought frost, fog, and the first real move from their enemies. Lucian's intelligence network intercepted a coded message between Cedric Waverley and Sir Reginald Hatch. The cipher was military grade, routed through 3 intermediary contacts, and would have been unbreakable if Lucian had not spent 4 years and a small fortune recruiting the best cryptographer in Europe, a disgraced Austrian mathematician named Voss, who lived in Lucien's basement and communicated exclusively through handwritten notes slid under his door. The decoded message was 15 words long. The Ravenscar problem requires permanent resolution. Winter Council. Coordinate with parliamentary contacts. Lucian read the message once. He burned it. Then he walked to the war room where Serafina was reviewing shipping records and placed both hands flat on the desk. "They are going to move against us at the Winter Council." Serafina looked up. Her eyes were sharp, focused. "How? I do not know yet." The message was thin on specifics. But permanent resolution is not a phrase men use when they intend to file a parliamentary complaint. Assassination. Almost certainly. Yours or mine? Possibly both. Though I suspect I am the primary target. Removing me destabilizes Blackthorn's political network. You would be dealt with separately, probably through legal channels. Fabricated charges. Another trial. Another veil destroyed by the same machine that killed your father. Serafina's face hardened. It was a transformation Lucian had come to recognize, and against his better judgment, admire. When danger approached, most people contracted. They became smaller, quieter, more cautious. Serafina expanded. Her spine straightened, her eyes sharpened. She became more of herself, not less. "Then we do not wait for the Winter Council," she said. "We strike first." With what? We have fragments, circumstantial connections, nothing that would survive a parliamentary hearing. Then we do not take this to Parliament. We take it to the people who matter, the ones Hatch and Waverley have been exploiting for 30 years, the factory workers, the miners, the families who have watched their children die in unsafe conditions while these men count their profits. You want to start a revolution. I want to start a reckoning. There is a difference. Lucian studied her across the desk. Candlelight illuminated the maps and documents spread between them like a battlefield rendered in paper and ink. Outside, London shivered under the first hard frost of winter. "If we do this," he said slowly, "there is no retreat. We expose Hatch and Waverley. We expose the entire network. Every corrupt lord, every bribed magistrate, every falsified record. The system will not reform itself quietly. It will fight back. And the people it fights hardest are the ones who pull the curtain open." "I know." "Your father pulled the curtain open." "I know. Look what happened to him. My father pulled the curtain open alone. He had no allies, no resources, no one standing beside him when they came for him in the middle of the night." She held his gaze. "I am not alone." The words hung in the air between them. Lucian felt something crack inside his chest. Not break. Crack. The way ice cracks on a river when the current beneath it is too strong to contain. He had spent his entire life building walls thick enough to hold back every weakness, every vulnerability, every human need that could be exploited by the predators who surrounded him. And this woman, this infuriating, brilliant, reckless woman who threw inkwells at paintings and read his dead mother's handwriting by firelight, had found the one fracture in his armor that no amount of wealth or power could seal. She made him want to be something other than a weapon, and that terrified him more than any assassination plot ever could. "We begin tomorrow," he said. "Hargrove will arrange secure messengers to our contacts in the north. Voss will intercept every communication leaving Waverley's estate, and you will cancel all public appearances until further notice. I will not hide. I am not asking you to hide. I am asking you to survive long enough to finish what we started. And if they come for us before we are ready? Lucian straightened. The firelight caught the scar on his jaw. His eyes were ice and iron and something else, something new, something that had not existed in those eyes 6 weeks ago. Then they will learn what I learned when I was 14 years old, standing beside 2 coffins in the rain. What is that, Tom? That the most dangerous creature in the world is not a man with power. It is a man with nothing left to lose. He paused. And I have just discovered that I have something to lose after all. He left the room before she could respond. Serafina sat alone in the war room, surrounded by maps of an empire built on vengeance, and pressed her hand against her chest, where something fierce and terrified was beating much too fast. The following week moved with the precision of a military campaign and the tension of a loaded gun. Lucien dispatched coded instructions to his northern network. Factory managers loyal to Blackthorn began quietly documenting safety violations, wage theft, and evidence of bribery connected to Waverley's mining operations. Sympathetic journalists received anonymous packages containing financial records that contradicted Waverley's public filings. And in 3 separate pubs across London, Serafina's contacts in the reform movement began organizing workers for testimony that would be devastating if it ever reached a public forum. But Hatch's network was watching. On the night of December 12th, Serafina attended the Royal Opera House against Lucien's explicit orders. She went because a contact in the Foreign Office had agreed to meet her during the intermission, carrying documents that proved Hatch had been funneling government contracts to shell companies controlled by Waverley. The contact never arrived. Instead, as Serafina descended the steps outside the Opera House, 3 men emerged from the fog. They moved fast. Professional. The first grabbed her arm. The second produced a blade that caught the gaslight with a cold, surgical gleam. The third blocked the street behind them. Serafina did not scream. Screaming required the kind of panic she had burned out of herself years ago in a rented room in Vienna, the night 2 men had tried to kill her for asking questions about her father's trial. She had survived that night by driving a letter opener through one man's hand and jumping from a second-story window into a canal. Tonight she had no letter opener and no canal. The blade came toward her throat. Then the world exploded. Gunfire shattered the silence. The man with the blade jerked sideways as a bullet punched through his shoulder. The second attacker spun toward the sound and caught a round in the chest that dropped him to the cobblestones. The third man ran. He made it 11 steps before a figure emerged from the shadows and struck him across the temple with the silver head of a walking cane so hard the crack echoed off the opera house walls. Lucien Ravenscar stood over the fallen man, breathing hard, his coat splattered with rain and someone else's blood. Behind him, 2 Blackthorn guards emerged from the darkness, pistols still smoking. Serafina stared at him. You followed me. I had you followed. There is a difference. I was supposed to remain at the palace. But my patience for obedience apparently has limits where you are concerned. He stepped over the unconscious attacker and pulled his coat from his shoulders. He draped it around Serafina without asking permission. His hands lingered on her shoulders for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. The blade, she said. It was coated in something. Lucian looked at the weapon on the ground. Even in the dim gaslight, the oily residue on the edge was visible. Poisoned, he said quietly. The same method they used on my mother. A slow compound. You would not have felt it for hours. By then, no physician could have helped you. The rain fell harder. Blood mixed with water in the gutters. The wounded attacker groaned on the cobblestones. Lucien's hand tightened on Serafina's shoulder. This ends now, he said. His voice was low, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. No more waiting. No more strategy. They came for you with the same poison that killed her. That changes everything. Lucien, we need to be careful. If we move too fast... They tried to kill you. His voice cracked on the last word. The crack lasted less than a second. But it was there. Raw. Unmistakable. The sound of a man discovering that his fortress had a door he had forgotten to lock. They tried to take you from me. The words from me hung in the frozen air between them. Serafina looked up at him. Rain streaked down both their faces. His blue eyes burned with something that was not rage and not grief, but some terrible fusion of both, forged in the same furnace that had created everything else about him, too intense to look at directly and too honest to look away from. "We go to the Winter Council," he said, "both of us, and we burn it all down." She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were cold. His skin was colder. But where they met, something caught fire that neither of them had the vocabulary to name. "Together," she said. Inside the carriage, racing back toward Blackthorn Palace, neither of them spoke. But their hands remained intertwined on the seat between them, gripping with the desperate strength of two people who had spent their entire lives alone and had just discovered, in blood and rain and the echo of gunfire, that solitude was no longer survivable. 3 days before this Winter Council, a letter arrived at Blackthorn Palace bearing the personal seal of Sir Reginald Hatch. Lucien opened it in the war room while Seraphina watched. The message was brief. "Your Grace, I understand you intend to attend the Winter Council with certain materials that may cause discomfort to mutual acquaintances. I urge you to reconsider. The consequences of indiscretion can be far more severe than the satisfaction of revelation. As a demonstration of my sincerity, I have enclosed a gift. Yours in mutual respect, Hatch." Inside the envelope, beneath the letter, lay a small glass vial. It was empty, but the faint oily residue coating its interior was unmistakable. Arsenic compound. The same formula, the same poison. A message, a threat, a reminder. "I killed your mother. I can kill anyone you love." Lucien held the vial up to the candlelight. His hand was steady. His face was granite, but deep behind his eyes, in the place where the 14-year-old boy still stood beside two coffins in the rain, something ancient and monstrous woke from a sleep it had been faking for 20 years. He set the vial on the desk. He looked at Seraphina. 3 days, he said, and his voice sounded like the first crack of thunder before a storm that would level everything in its path. 3 days passed like a blade being sharpened. Lucien did not sleep. He stood in the war room each night while the palace groaned under December wind, studying the documents Seraphina had assembled over weeks of meticulous intelligence work. Financial ledgers, shipping manifests, coded correspondence decoded by Voss in the basement, witness statements from factory workers in the north who had agreed to testify in exchange for protection they were not entirely sure Blackthorn could provide. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same rotten center: Sir Reginald Hatch, Cedric Waverley, Lord Pemberton, a network of men who had operated behind the machinery of English government for 3 decades, feeding on the labor of thousands while eliminating anyone who threatened their profits. The vial sat on Lucien's desk where he had placed it the night Hatch's letter arrived. He had not moved it. He had not locked it away. He kept it in plain sight the way a soldier keeps a scar visible, not as decoration, but as data. A reminder of what the enemy was capable of. A calibration tool for the violence he was preparing to unleash. Seraphina found him at 4 a.m. on the day before the Winter Council. He stood at the window of the war room, coatless, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms braced against the glass. London sprawled below in frozen darkness. His breath fogged the window and vanished, fogged and vanished. A rhythm as mechanical as the factories he owned. She did not announce herself. She had learned weeks ago that Lucien always knew when she entered a room. Some predatory awareness wired into his nervous system that registered every shift in air pressure, every footstep, every change in the composition of silence. "You have not eaten since yesterday morning," she said. "I am not hungry." That was not a question about your appetite. It was a statement about your judgment. A man who starves himself before the most important day of his life is not being disciplined. He is being reckless. Lucien turned from the window. The candlelight caught the hollows beneath his eyes, the hard line of his jaw, the scar that ran along it like a signature written in someone else's blood. He looked like a man who had been at war for so long that peace had become a foreign language he no longer trusted himself to speak. "I have been thinking about my father," he said. Seraphina waited. She had learned that too. When Lucien spoke about his parents, interruption was not just unwelcome. It was structurally impossible. The words came from somewhere deep enough that they followed their own current, and anything that disrupted the flow would seal it shut for weeks. The night before they came for him, he sat in the library and read poetry to my mother. I was 13. I stood in the hallway listening through the door because I was supposed to be asleep, and I knew that if He caught me, he would pretend to be angry, and then let me sit on the floor beside his chair while he read. He always did that. The pretend anger. It was a game. His version of affection. He paused. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the room, beyond the city, beyond time itself. He read her a poem about the sea. I do not remember the words. I remember his voice. Quiet, steady. The voice of a man who believed completely that the world he had built would still be standing in the morning. 3 weeks later, he was in prison. 8 months after that, he was dead. And the library where he read that poem became the room I sealed shut because I could not walk past it without hearing his voice and wanting to tear the walls down with my hands. Serafina crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, not touching, close enough that their reflections overlapped in the dark glass. You opened that room, she said quietly. You opened that room. I would have kept it sealed forever. Is that what you are afraid of? That tomorrow will end the way it ended for him? Standing in a room full of men who have already decided your fate? Lucien's jaw worked, muscle and bone grinding against something harder than either. I am afraid of nothing. Liar. His eyes snapped to hers. Cold. Dangerous. The look that made ministers stammer and generals reconsider their positions. But Serafina had stopped flinching at that look somewhere around the 3rd week of their partnership. And tonight she met it with the steady calm of a woman who had mapped every defense he possessed and found the single door he could not lock. Everyone is afraid of something, she said. The question is whether you let it drive you or whether you drive it. And right now, standing in this room at 4 a.m. with food you will not eat and sleep you will not take, you are letting it drive. You do not understand. I understand everything. My father died in a cell. My mother died of grief. I spent 10 years in exile learning how to survive in countries where I did not speak the language and did not know the rules and had no one who gave a damn whether I woke up the next morning. Do not tell me I do not understand. I wrote the book you are reading. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the candle on the desk to gutter and recover. Lucien exhaled. It was not a sigh. It was something heavier. The sound of internal architecture shifting under a weight it had not been designed to carry. Hatch sent that vial because he knows what it means to me. He is not threatening your life. He is threatening my ability to function. A man consumed by fear for someone he cannot afford to lose is a man who makes mistakes. And mistakes are what Hatch feeds on. Then stop being consumed. That is like asking me to stop breathing. The words came out before he could catch them. Raw. Unfiltered. The kind of admission that Lucien Ravenscar had spent 20 years learning to strangle in its crib before it reached his mouth. He stared at Serafina with the expression of a man who had just discovered he was bleeding and could not find the wound. She did not flinch. She did not soften. She stepped closer. Then breathe, Lucien. Breathe and fight. Because tomorrow, we walk into a room full of men who have been killing people like us for 30 years. And I need you sharp. Not haunted. Not grieving. Sharp. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long time. The kind of looking that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with the terrifying process of allowing another human being to exist inside the walls you had built to keep them out. Yes, he said. Good. Now eat something. And for the sake of your own empire, sleep for at least 3 hours. You look like something the Thames rejected. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. A haunting in the architecture of a face that had forgotten how smiles worked. She left the room. He ate. He did not sleep. But he sat in the leather chair beside the fire and closed his eyes. And for 3 hours he let himself exist in a state that was not quite rest and not quite vigilance, but something in between. A place where the boy who had listened to his father read poetry and the man who had built an empire on the ruins of that boy's life could coexist without destroying each other. At 7 o'clock he rose, washed, dressed in a black suit cut like a weapon, and descended to the entrance hall where Serafina waited. She wore dark red, the color of old blood. Her hair was pulled back in a severe style that made her cheekbones look like they could cut glass. She carried a leather case containing every document, every ledger, every decoded message they had assembled over 6 weeks of work. Their eyes met across the entrance hall. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The carriage rolled through London under a sky so low and gray It felt like the city was being pressed into the earth by the hand of something enormous and indifferent, frost-coated every surface. Pedestrians moved through the streets with their heads down and their collars up, rushing toward warmth and ordinariness, unaware that the carriage passing them carried two people who were about to drive a knife into the heart of the most powerful conspiracy in England. Inside the carriage, Lucian sat with his hands resting on the silver head of his walking cane, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Serafina sat across from him reviewing documents with the focused calm of a surgeon preparing for an operation. "Waverley will speak first," she said without looking up. "He has been building his case against you for months. Treason charges, allegations of unauthorized military buildup in the north, financial irregularities in your railway contracts. He intends to present you as a rogue duke operating outside Crown authority. Let him. Let him? Lucien, if the council votes to investigate before we present our evidence, they will not vote. Waverley is not the threat. He is the distraction. Hatch is the architect. He will sit in the gallery and let Waverley expend his ammunition while he watches for our response. He wants to see what we have. He wants to gauge how dangerous we are before deciding whether to let the process play out or move to more direct methods." "You mean assassination? I mean, he will have armed men positioned inside Westminster. If our evidence is strong enough to threaten his network, he will not wait for a parliamentary vote. He will end it in that chamber." Serafina looked up from the documents. "You are telling me we might not walk out of that building alive?" "I am telling you that the possibility exists. I have taken precautions. Blackthorn guards will be positioned at every exit. Hargrove has coordinated with loyal officers in the Metropolitan Police. And Voss intercepted a message last night suggesting that Hatch has hired 8 men through a contact in the East End. Former military. Experienced with close quarters work. 8 men. That we know of. And how many do we have?" "Enough." "That is not a number, Lucien. It's 32 inside the building, 40 outside, 12 on the rooftops with rifles, and one very angry duke with a personal interest in seeing this through." Serafina closed the leather case and held it against her chest. Her breathing was controlled. Her posture was perfect, but her knuckles were white where they gripped the leather. And Lucian noticed because he noticed everything about her now. Every micro-expression, every shift in tension, every breath that came half a second faster than the one before. He leaned forward across the carriage. "Serafina." She looked at him. "When we enter that chamber, stay beside me. Do not separate from me for any reason. If something goes wrong, move toward the east corridor. 3rd door on the left. It leads to a passage beneath Westminster that exits at a dock on the river. There will be a boat waiting." "I am not running." "You are not running. You are surviving. There is a difference, and I need you to survive because if I lose you in there, I will burn that building to the ground with everyone inside it, and I would prefer to avoid that outcome if possible." His voice was steady. His eyes were not. Behind the ice and the control and the 20 years of practiced ruthlessness, something was moving. Something that looked a lot like the kind of fear that has nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with the shattering discovery that your own survival has become secondary to someone else's. "I'm not going to die in Westminster, Sir," Serafina said. "And neither are you. We are going to walk into that room, and we are going to tear their world apart, and we are going to walk out together. Do you understand me?" "I understand you." "Good. Then stop looking at me like you're saying goodbye." He sat back. The carriage rocked over cobblestones. The iron wheels ground against frost. "I was not saying goodbye," he said quietly. "I was memorizing." She did not ask what he was memorizing. She already knew. Westminster Hall rose above them like a monument to the belief that stone and ceremony could contain the ambitions of men who had outgrown both. Lucien stepped down from the carriage and offered Serafina his hand. She took it. Their fingers interlocked for 3 seconds before they separated and walked side by side through the main entrance. Flanked by Blackthorn guards in black military coats who moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers who knew exactly what was about to happen and had made peace with it. Inside, the Winter Council was already gathering. The great chamber buzzed with the low, predatory murmur of 200 aristocrats, politicians, bankers, and military officers taking their seats beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of English triumph. Gold leaf caught the morning light streaming through stained glass. The speaker's chair sat elevated on a marble platform at the far end. Side galleries rose in tiers where observers and their staff watched like spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Lucian scanned the room with the efficiency of a man who had been mapping threats since childhood. Lord Pemberton sat in the third row, his face arranged in the practiced neutrality of a career politician who had survived 30 years by never being the first to commit. Lady Pemberton beside him, jeweled and watchful, her smile carrying the warmth of a closed trap. Cedric Waverley occupied the front bench on the opposing side, surrounded by allies. He was a tall man, lean, with silver hair swept back from a face that photographed well and concealed badly. His eyes tracked Lucien across the chamber with the focused intensity of a man who had spent months constructing a weapon he intended to deploy in the next hour. And in the upper gallery, half hidden in shadow, sat Sir Reginald Hatch. Lucien felt the old man's gaze like a cold finger pressed against the back of his neck. Hatch was 73 years old, small, unremarkable in appearance. The kind of man you would pass on the street without a second glance, which was precisely how he had operated for 3 decades. He had never held public office. He had never sought a title beyond the knighthood he had received 40 years ago for services to the crown that no official record specified. He existed in the space between government and shadow, pulling threads that moved men who moved nations. Looking at him now, quiet and still in the gallery, Lucien felt the presence of the thing that had killed his mother. Not the poison, not the physician, the intelligence behind it, the patient, mechanical cruelty of a man who destroyed lives with the same emotional investment most people brought to balancing a ledger. Serafina touched his arm. "I see him," she murmured. "Everyone sees him. No one looks at him. That has always been his advantage. Not anymore." They took their seats. The proceedings opened with the speaker calling order. Routine matters were dispatched with the bored efficiency of bureaucracy. Tax amendments, colonial trade reports, a dispute over naval appropriations that generated 20 minutes of passionate argument between men who would never set foot on a warship. Lucien sat through it all with the patience of a predator waiting for the herd to settle. Then Waverley stood. The chamber shifted. Conversations died. Every eye in the room recalibrated. Waverley was a skilled orator. Lucien had always acknowledged that, even while despising him. The man could build an argument the way an architect built a cathedral, layer by deliberate layer, each element supporting the next until the whole structure rose with an inevitability that felt like truth even when it was constructed entirely from fabrication. "Honored members of this council," Waverley began. His voice carried easily through the chamber, rich and measured. "I come before you today not as an accuser but as a servant of this nation's interests. For too long, we have tolerated the consolidation of industrial and military power in the hands of a single individual whose loyalty to the crown has never been tested because no one has dared to test it." He paused for effect. The chamber was silent. "I speak of the Duke of Blackthorn." Murmurs rippled through the benches. Lucien did not move. His expression remained exactly as it had been since he sat down. Carved. Still. Giving nothing. In the past 5 years alone, the Blackthorn estate has acquired controlling interests in 47 factories, 12 rail lines, 9 shipping companies, and 3 private banks. The Duke maintains a personal security force numbering in the hundreds. He has constructed fortified positions throughout the Northern Territories under the guise of industrial development. And he has, without parliamentary authorization or crown approval, assumed de facto governing authority over an area larger than most English counties. Waverley turned to face Lucien directly. "Your Grace, these are not the activities of a nobleman. These are the activities of a man building a separate state within the borders of England. And this council has a duty to determine whether that state serves the crown or threatens it." Applause from Waverley's allies, nervous shifting from the uncommitted middle. Silence from Blackthorn's supporters, who knew better than to react before their duke gave a signal. The speaker looked toward Lucien. "Does the Duke of Blackthorn wish to respond?" Lucien stood. The room contracted. There was something about his physical presence that altered the geometry of any space he occupied. He was not the tallest man in the chamber, not the broadest, but he carried himself with the gravitational certainty of a man who had decided long ago that the world would arrange itself around him, or be rearranged. And 2 decades of evidence suggested he was right. He walked to the center of the floor, slowly, His boot heels struck the marble with a rhythm that sounded deliberate, calculated. Each step a statement. He stopped, turned, and faced the chamber. He did not speak immediately. The silence lasted 8 seconds. In parliamentary terms, 8 seconds was an eternity, long enough for men to shift in their seats, long enough for Waverley's confident expression to develop a hairline crack, long enough for Sir Reginald Hatch in the gallery above to lean forward by exactly 1 inch. Duke Waverley. Lucian's voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet the way a rifle is quiet before the trigger is pulled. You have presented an impressive inventory of my holdings. Allow me to add to it. I also control the largest coal reserves in northern England. I supply steel to the Royal Navy. My rail lines transport 60% of the manufactured goods that reach London's markets. And the 3 private banks you mentioned hold deposits from 17 members of this council, including 4 who applauded your speech just now. No one moved. You call this a threat to the crown. I call it the infrastructure that keeps this country functioning. Remove Blackthorn from the equation, and within 6 months your factories have no steel, your railways have no coal, your navy has no ships, and your economy collapses into a depression that will make the Hungry 40s look like a holiday. He let that settle. But I did not come here today to defend my holdings. Every man in this room knows what Blackthorn provides. Every man in this room profits from it, directly or indirectly, including you, Duke Waverley, especially you. Waverley's jaw tightened. I fail to see what my personal finances have to do with this discussion. Then let me clarify. Lucian turned to Serafina. She stood, opened the leather case, and removed a stack of documents bound in black cord. She carried them to the speaker's desk and laid them down with the care of a woman handling explosives. What you are looking at, Lucian said, is 6 years of financial records, shipping manifests, coded correspondence, and witness testimony documenting a criminal conspiracy involving at least 12 members of this council, 3 senior government officials, and a network of shell companies designed to funnel public funds into private accounts. The chamber erupted. The speaker banged his gavel. Order. Order. The conspiracy, Lucian continued, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, was coordinated by Sir Reginald Hatch, who is sitting in the gallery above us at this very moment. Its primary beneficiary is Duke Cedric Waverley, whose mining operations in the northeast have been underreporting output by approximately 40% for the past 8 years, evading taxation on profits exceeding £2 million. Waverley was on his feet. This is slander. This is fabricated nonsense designed to deflect from your own. Sit down, Cedric. The words were not shouted. They were delivered with a calm so absolute that Waverley's voice died in his throat. For a moment, the 2 dukes faced each other across the chamber floor, and the room held its breath. Sit down, Lucian repeated, or I will read aloud the letter you sent to Hatch 3 weeks ago requesting, and I quote the decoded text, permanent resolution of the Ravenscar problem at the Winter Council. Would you like me to explain to this assembly what permanent resolution means? Because there are 8 men positioned in this building right now who were hired through your associate in the East End to ensure I do not leave this chamber alive. My security team identified them an hour ago. They are currently being detained in the East Corridor. Would you like to see them? Waverley's face lost all color. In the gallery, Hatch stood. Every eye in the chamber turned upward. The old man looked down at Lucian with an expression that had not changed in 30 years. Calm. Calculating. The expression of a man for whom human beings were variables in an equation and nothing more. He adjusted his cuffs. He smoothed the front of his coat. Then he walked along the gallery toward the exit, with the unhurried pace of someone who had always known this moment might come and had prepared accordingly. Lucian watched him. Hatch. The old man paused. My mother's name was Eleanor. She liked poetry and winter gardens and reading to her son before bed. You killed her with arsenic administered through a physician you purchased like a piece of furniture. I want you to know that I remember her name. I want you to know that every single thing I have built was built to reach this moment. And I want you to know that the evidence in those documents does not just describe your crimes. It traces them. Every transaction, every intermediary, every payment, every body. You are not leaving this building a free man. You are leaving it in chains, or you are not leaving it at all. Mbatumam. Hatch looked down at him. The silence in the chamber was total. Then Hatch smiled. It was a small expression, practiced. The smile of a man who had survived 3 decades of political warfare by never being surprised and never being cornered. "You are your father's son after all," he said. His voice was thin, precise, carrying easily in the dead air. He also believed that truth was enough. He was wrong. Truth requires power to enforce it, and power, young Ravenscar, is not a document in a leather case. It is a consensus. And I have spent 30 years building one that your theatrics cannot dismantle in an afternoon. He nodded toward the chamber floor. Look around you. Count the faces. Count the men in this room who depend on the system I built. The contracts. The appointments. The favors owed and favors collected. You can burn my ledgers. You can arrest my associates. But the structure survives because every man in this room benefits from it, and turkeys do not vote for the butcher. Your metaphor needs work, Lucian said. Your strategy needs reality. You have evidence. Congratulations. Evidence becomes a trial. Trials become delays. Delays become negotiations. Negotiations become settlements. And settlements become the quiet burial of inconvenient truths by men who would rather preserve the system that feeds them than reform it into something that might not. I have seen it happen 100 times. I orchestrated most of them. Lucian stared at him. Hatch descended the gallery stairs with the measured pace of a man who believed he had already won the argument. He reached the chamber floor and walked toward the exit. 2 Blackthorn guards stepped into his path. Hatch stopped. He looked at the guards. He looked at Lucien. You would restrain a knight of the realm in the halls of Parliament? I would restrain the man who murdered my mother in a sewer if that is where I found him. And what will that accomplish? Another scandal, another trial, another decade of legal proceedings while the men in this room quietly dismantle your evidence and rebuild what you tore down. You cannot fight entropy, Ravenscar. You can only postpone it. Seraphina stepped forward. She had been standing at the edge of the chamber floor, watching Hatch's performance with the clinical attention of a woman who had spent 10 years studying the mechanics of her own family's destruction. Now she walked toward him with the same unhurried calm he had displayed moments before. And when she stopped 3 feet from the old man, the resemblance between their composure was unsettling. "Sir Reginald," she said, "you are absolutely right." Hatch's eyebrows rose by a fraction. "I beg your pardon?" "You are right. Evidence becomes trials. Trials become delays. The system protects itself. That is exactly what happened to my father. You destroyed him through the very institutions he served, because those institutions valued stability over justice. I have spent 10 years studying that lesson, and I learned it well enough to know that if we relied on Parliament alone, you would survive." She reached into the leather case and removed a second set of documents, which is why we did not rely on Parliament alone. She turned to face the chamber. 3 hours ago, the evidence you see on the speaker's desk was simultaneously delivered to the editors of 4 major London newspapers, 2 wire services, and the foreign correspondents of 12 international publications. The decoded correspondence between Sir Reginald Hatch and Duke Waverley is currently being typeset for tomorrow's morning editions. The financial records documenting 30 years of fraud, bribery, and assassination are being reviewed by journalists who have no political allegiance to anyone in this room and no interest in quiet settlements. The chamber detonated. Men were on their feet, shouting. The speaker's gavel cracked against wood so hard the handle splintered. Waverley screamed something that was swallowed by the roar. Pemberton lunged for the exit and was blocked by Blackthorn guards. In the gallery, observers pressed against railings, craning to see the chaos below. Hatch stood perfectly still. His smile was gone. For the first time in 30 years, the machinery behind his eyes was processing an outcome he had not anticipated. Not the evidence. He had anticipated that. Not the parliamentary confrontation. He had anticipated that too. What he had not anticipated was the woman standing in front of him with the same patient, surgical intelligence he had spent a lifetime cultivating, deployed with a ferocity he had never encountered because it came from somewhere he did not understand. It came from grief, not the weak, performative grief of aristocratic mourning, the deep, Structural grief of a child who had lost everything and rebuilt herself from the wreckage with nothing but intelligence and rage, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that the men who destroyed her world would one day stand exactly where Hatch was standing now. "You killed my father," Serafina said. Her voice was level, steady, carrying beneath the chaos like a current beneath ice. "You destroyed my family. You took everything from me, and you did it with the same indifference you would bring to canceling a subscription. And you were right that truth alone is not enough. Truth needs amplification. It needs reach. It needs an audience too large to silence and too angry to negotiate with. By tomorrow morning, every literate person in England will know your name and what you have done, not through a parliamentary process you can control, through the press, through public fury, through the one force in a democracy that even you cannot purchase." Hatch looked at her. Then he looked at Lucian. Then he did something no one in the chamber expected. He reached inside his coat. Blackthorn guards surged forward. Lucian moved with a speed that contradicted every ounce of aristocratic composure he had displayed that morning, placing himself between Serafina and Hatch, in a motion so instinctive it bypassed every calculation and strategy he had ever constructed, and came from somewhere much older and much more dangerous. Hatch withdrew an envelope. He held it up. "Insurance," he said calmly. "I have always believed in insurance." He opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. "This is a signed affidavit from a clerk in the Home Office. It confirms that Lady Serafina Vale entered England 18 months ago using forged travel documents provided by a known intelligence operative of the French government. Under the Treason Felony Act, this constitutes espionage. The penalty is life imprisonment." Oish. The chamber went silent. Lucian's blood dropped to a temperature that would have alarmed a physician. Hatch continued, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of a man reading terms of surrender. "The documents are authentic. The clerk will testify. And the operative who provided the forged papers is currently in custody in Marseille, cooperating with French authorities in exchange for leniency. If your newspaper friends print a single word of your evidence, this affidavit goes to the Attorney General by morning. Lady Vale will be arrested before sunset." He looked at Serafina. "Your father made the same mistake. He believed exposure would protect him. It did not. Because the men who control the system can always generate a counter-narrative faster than the truth can spread. You have given your evidence to journalists. I have given mine to prosecutors. The question is which one the public believes first. And in my experience, the public always believes the story that requires the least amount of thinking." The chamber was frozen. Lucian stood between Serafina and Hatch, his body positioned as a physical barrier, his mind racing through calculations at a speed that would have destroyed lesser men. The affidavit was a problem. If the documents were genuine and the clerk was willing to testify, the government could arrest Serafina on espionage charges before the newspaper stories gained traction. The trial would dominate public attention. The evidence against Hatch would be buried beneath the spectacle of a treason prosecution. And Serafina would disappear into the same legal machinery that had consumed her father. Hatch had anticipated everything. Almost everything. Lucian turned to face the chamber. His voice cut through the silence with an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the absolute, terrifying certainty of a man who had decided that the rules no longer applied. "Members of this council, in the next 60 seconds, you will be asked to make a choice. Not a political choice, not a procedural choice, a survival choice." He held up one hand. "In my possession is enough evidence to destroy every man connected to Hatch's network. Financial ruin, criminal prosecution, public disgrace, every alliance, every secret, every transaction. All of it documented, all of it verified, all of it already in the hands of the press." He held up the other hand. "Sir Reginald possesses an affidavit designed to discredit Lady Vale and delay the reckoning. A legal maneuver, a stalling tactic, the kind of procedural weapon this system was designed to provide to men like him." He lowered both hands. "Here is your choice. You can side with Hatch. You can allow this affidavit to proceed. You can bury the evidence and preserve the system that has fed you for 30 years. And in return, I will dismantle every Blackthorn operation that supplies your factories, your railways, your banks, and your households. Every contract canceled, every supply line severed, every financial arrangement dissolved. Not through legal proceedings, through my own authority, effective immediately. The economic consequences will reach your doorsteps within the week. But What? Dead silence. Or you can side with the evidence. You can reject Hatch's affidavit as the desperate fabrication of a cornered man. You can allow the press to publish what it has already received. And you can begin the process of removing the rot from this institution before it consumes you along with everyone else. He looked at Hatch. You were right about one thing, old man. Power is a consensus, so let us find out whose consensus holds. The chamber hung suspended. 200 men. 200 calculations. 200 private assessments of risk, loyalty, self-interest, and survival. The mathematics of power reduced to its most fundamental equation. Which threat is closer? Which consequence is faster? Which man in this room is more dangerous to defy? Pemberton moved first. He stood slowly from his bench, his face gray, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked at Hatch. He looked at Lucien. He looked at the documents on the speaker's desk. Then he walked across the chamber floor and stood beside Lucien. I want immunity, he said. His voice cracked. Full immunity. In writing. Before I say another word. You will get what you deserve, Pemberton. Nothing more. Then God help me. I told you, I do not deal in that currency. One by one, others followed. Lords who had been calculating their positions for months suddenly discovered that the mathematics had changed. Bankers who had funded Waverley's operations realized that Blackthorn's economic leverage was not a bluff. Military officers who had accepted Hatch's patronage understood that patronage from a destroyed man carried no value. The consensus shifted, not because they believed in justice, not because they were moved by truth. Because Lucien Ravenscar had spent 20 years constructing an empire so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of England that removing him was more dangerous than removing the men he accused. He had turned the system's own survival instinct into his weapon, and the system chose to survive. Hatch watched the defections with the expression of a man observing a mathematical proof he had believed was complete, reveal an error in its foundational axiom. One by one, the men he had controlled, bribed, and protected for 30 years stood and walked to the other side of the chamber. Waverley sat alone on his bench, abandoned, his face the color of old paper. Hatch straightened his coat. He folded the affidavit and placed it back in the envelope. He tucked the envelope inside his coat with the same meticulous precision he brought to everything. Then he looked at Lucien across the empty space between them and spoke with a voice that carried no emotion at all. You have won the room. You have not won the war. Rooms change. Men change. The evidence will be challenged. The press will move on. And in 6 months, the same men who stood beside you today will be calculating whether it is safer to support you or to bury you. That is the nature of the system you claim to despise, but depend upon entirely. Perhaps, Lucien said, but you will not be here to see it. He nodded to the Blackthorn guards. They moved toward Hatch. The old man did not resist. He did not run. He extended his wrists with the calm dignity of a man who had always known this moment was possible and had decided long ago that dignity was the one thing no one could confiscate. As the guards escorted him toward the chamber doors, Hatch paused beside Serafina. He looked at her. Your father would have been proud, he said, for whatever that is worth from the man who killed him. Serafina stared at him. Her eyes were dry. Her face was stone. It is worth exactly nothing, she said. Which is what you are now. Hatch nodded once. Then the guards led him through the doors and he disappeared into the corridor beyond. The chamber exhaled. Waverley was escorted out by parliamentary security, protesting in a voice that grew smaller with each step. Pemberton sat in a corner being sick into a wastepaper basket. The speaker had abandoned his chair entirely and was conferring with legal advisors in urgent whispers. Throughout the gallery, observers were already writing dispatches, drafting headlines, composing the first rough sentences of the story that would dominate every newspaper in England by morning. Lucien stood in the center of the chamber floor. He should have felt triumph. 20 years of construction, culminating in a single devastating hour. The network that had destroyed his parents, exposed. The man who had orchestrated their deaths, in custody. The political establishment, realigned around his authority through a combination of evidence and economic coercion that would be studied and debated for decades. He felt nothing. No, that was not right. He felt one thing. He turned and found Serafina standing exactly where she had been throughout the confrontation. Beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. Her leather case was empty. Her face was pale. Her hands were steady. "It is done," she said. "No," he said. "It is beginning." They walked out of Westminster together. The Blackthorn carriage waited at the entrance, surrounded by guards. The grey London sky had opened into freezing rain that plastered their hair to their faces and soaked their clothes within seconds. Neither hurried. Inside the carriage, the door closed. The sounds of London fell away. Rain hammered the roof. The wheels began to turn. Serafina pressed her back against the seat and closed her eyes. For the first time since Lucien had known her, she looked exhausted. Not physically, something deeper. The exhaustion of a woman who had carried 10 years of grief and rage to its destination and discovered that arrival did not feel the way she had imagined. "What happens now?" she asked without opening her eyes. "Now Hatch's network collapses. The press publishes. Parliament scrambles to distance itself from the wreckage. And every man who profited from the conspiracy spends the next year deciding whether to cooperate or disappear. I meant what happens to us." The carriage rocked over cobblestones. Rain streaked the windows. Lucien looked at the woman sitting across from him. The woman who had broken into his sealed library and read his mother's handwriting by firelight, who had thrown inkwells at his grandfather's portrait, who had stood in front of the man who murdered her father and dismantled him with words so precise they cut like surgical instruments. The woman who had walked into his fortress and found the one room he could not defend. "I do not know," he said. It was the most honest thing he had ever spoken. Serafina opened her eyes and looked at him. The carriage turned onto the embankment. Through the rain-streaked window, Blackthorn Palace rose against the gray sky, massive and dark and impenetrable. "Take me home," she said. And the word home, spoken inside that carriage, in the space between two people who had spent their entire lives without one, landed with a weight that neither evidence nor power nor 20 years of calculated ruthlessness could have prepared him for. The carriage rolled through the gates of Blackthorn Palace, and somewhere behind them, in a holding cell beneath Westminster, Sir Reginald Hatch sat on a wooden bench, folded his hands in his lap, and smiled, because the affidavit in his coat was not the only insurance he carried, and the men he had contacted 3 days ago were not in London. They were in the north, and they were already moving. The first report arrived at Blackthorn Palace 47 minutes after midnight. Lucien was in the war room when Hargrove entered without knocking. That alone was enough. Hargrove had knocked on every door he had approached for 40 years. The absence of that sound carried more information than the words that followed. "Sheffield, Your Grace. The Blackthorn Steelworks. A fire broke out 2 hours ago. The main foundry is destroyed. The foreman reports it was deliberate. Accelerant was used. The night guards were found unconscious outside the perimeter wall." Lucien set down his whiskey. "Casualties? 14 workers were inside when it started. 8 are confirmed dead. 6 are in critical condition. The local physician says 2 will not survive the night. Ogi, ikokes." The numbers landed in Lucien's chest like stones dropped into deep water. 8 dead. Workers. Men who woke before dawn and fed furnaces with their bare hands because Blackthorn paid better than the alternatives, and the alternatives were starvation. Men whose names appeared on payroll ledgers he signed every quarter without reading because reading the names of 10,000 workers was impractical, and not reading them was the kind of strategic detachment he had cultivated until it became indistinguishable from who he was. 8 of those names were now irrelevant. Which guards were on rotation? Blackthorn men, 3rd Company, all hand-picked. How were they incapacitated? Chloroform applied from behind. Whoever did this knew the patrol schedule, the shift changes, and the exact location of every sentry post. Inside information. Someone with access to Blackthorn's operational security had handed it to the enemy. Lucien stood and walked to the map wall. Sheffield, northeast. The steelworks supplied raw material to 6 other Blackthorn operations and provided the primary employment for a town of 12,000 people. Destroying it was not vandalism, it was amputation. Wake Voss. I need every communication intercepted in the last 72 hours decoded and on my desk within the hour. And get me Commander Aldridge. I want a full security assessment of every Blackthorn facility north of Birmingham before sunrise. Hargrove hesitated. Lucien looked at him. What? Commander Aldridge departed the palace at 9 o'clock this evening, Your Grace. He said he was conducting a routine inspection of the Thames perimeter. He has not returned. His escort reported that he dismissed them at London Bridge and proceeded on foot alone. The room temperature seemed to drop. Lucian processed this information the way a machine processes metal. Raw input fed through analytical systems until it emerged as something useful. Commander Aldridge, head of Blackthorn's personal security force, the man who coordinated guard rotations, the man who designed patrol schedules, the man who knew the exact location of every sentry post at every Blackthorn facility in England, the man who had been in Lucian's employ for 11 years. Find him, Lucian said. Now. The second report arrived at 3 in the morning. A coal depot in Leeds had been set ablaze. The entire winter supply for Blackthorn's northern rail operations reduced to ash. Damage estimated at £40,000. No casualties this time. The depot had been empty, but the fire had been timed to coincide with the Sheffield attack, which meant coordination. Planning. Resources. The third report came at dawn. A Blackthorn cargo ship docked at Newcastle had been scuttled in the harbor. The crew had been locked below decks and would have drowned if a harbor patrol had not noticed the listing hull and cut them free. 14 sailors, 3 of them boys under 16. Lucian read each report standing at the war room window while London woke beneath a sky the color of bruised steel. He had not moved from that position for 4 hours. His body was still. His breathing was controlled. But his eyes had changed. Something behind them had shifted into a register that Hargrove recognized from 20 years of service and had hoped never to see again. The last time those eyes had looked like that, Lucian had been 19 years old, standing in a Liverpool dockyard over the body of a man who had tried to cheat him on a steel contract. The man had pulled a knife. Lucian had taken it from him and used it to carve a message into the wooden crate beside the man's head while he bled on the ground. The message read, Blackthorn. The man had survived. He had never done business in Liverpool again. Neither had anyone who heard the story. That had been the violence of a young man establishing dominance. What Hargrove saw in Lucian's eyes now was something different, older, colder. The violence of a man who had built a world and was watching it burn. Serafina entered the war room at 7 o'clock. She had dressed quickly. Her hair was pulled back, no jewelry. Her face carried the sharp, alert quality of someone who had been woken by bad news and had already processed it into operational parameters before her feet touched the floor. She looked at the reports spread across the desk. She looked at the map wall where Lucian had marked each attack in red ink. Sheffield, Leeds, Newcastle. A diagonal line cutting across the north like a wound. How many dead? 12 confirmed, possibly more. The Sheffield count is still rising. Aldridge? Missing. Serafina absorbed this the way she absorbed everything. Completely, without visible reaction. The reaction happened deeper, in the place where her analytical mind interfaced with the grief she carried like a second skeleton, structural and invisible and bearing the weight of everything above it. He turned, she said. Not a question. The evidence points that direction. Evidence does not point, Lucy. Aldridge knew your security architecture. He knew your patrol schedules. He knew where your operations were vulnerable. Whoever did this needed that information, and Aldridge is the only man alive who had all of it in one place. He did not turn. He was turned. The question is when. Lucian looked at her. The red marks on the map wall threw shadows across his face. Hatch contacted men in the north 3 days before the Winter Council. The intercepted message referenced permanent resolution. I assumed it meant the assassination attempt at Westminster. I was wrong. Westminster was the feint. This was the permanent resolution, not killing me, destroying my infrastructure, crippling my ability to enforce the economic leverage I used against Parliament. Without your factories, your rail lines, your supply chains, the threat you made at the council is empty. Not empty, diminished, but that is enough. A diminished threat invites challenge. And every man who stood beside me yesterday did so because I was the more dangerous option. If I am no longer the more dangerous option, they will recalculate. How long before the recalculation begins? It has already begun. Pemberton sent a message this morning withdrawing his cooperation with the inquiry. He cited security concerns. Security concerns. That means he received a threat or an offer. Pemberton has always been purchasable. The only variable is the price. Deus Busayam Bonares Kitos. Serafina sat down at the desk and spread the reports in front of her. Her hands moved through the documents with the systematic precision of a woman who had learned that information was the only wall between survival and destruction. The attacks are coordinated but limited, she said. 3 targets, all high value, all designed to inflict maximum economic damage with minimum military exposure. Whoever planned this understood your operations well enough to identify the 3 nodes whose destruction would cascade through the entire network. Aldridge. Aldridge provided the intelligence, but intelligence without execution is just data. Someone deployed men to 3 separate locations across 200 miles of English countryside, armed them with accelerants and chloroform and the specific knowledge needed to scuttle a cargo ship, and coordinated the timing so precisely that all 3 attacks occurred within a 4-hour window. That is not the work of a corrupt security commander. That is the work of a military strategist. Lucien's jaw tightened. He knew. He had known since the first report, but knowing something and saying it out loud were different acts, and the space between them was filled with a kind of nausea that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul learning that the walls it had trusted were built on sand. Waverley is in custody, he said. Hatch is in custody. Set. Hatch smiled when they arrested him. You told me that. A man facing criminal prosecution does not smile unless he knows something his captors do not. The affidavit. The insurance. The affidavit was the visible insurance. The kind you show because showing it serves a purpose. Hatch is not a man who carries one weapon. He is a man who carries layers. The affidavit was designed to threaten me. The attacks in the north were designed to threaten you. And whatever comes next will be designed to threaten what we built together. You think there is a next? I think Hatch has been operating for 30 years and has survived every attempt to dislodge him because he plans in sequences, not events. Sheffield, Leeds, Newcastle. Those are the opening moves. If we do not respond correctly, the next move will be worse. A knock at the door. Hargrove entered carrying a sealed envelope. This arrived by special courier 10 minutes ago, Your Grace. The courier was not Blackthorn's staff. He refused to identify his employer. He said only that the message was urgent and that you would understand. Lucien took the envelope. The seal was plain red wax. No crest, no markings. He broke the seal and read the contents. Then he read them again. His hand did not tremble. His face did not change. But something happened to the air around him. A compression, a density, as though the molecules in the room had rearranged themselves around a new center of gravity, and that center was made of something toxic. Serafina watched him. What is it? He set the letter on the desk. She picked it up and read it. The letter was handwritten. The penmanship was precise, disciplined, almost elegant, the kind of handwriting produced by a man who had been trained in military correspondence and had never abandoned the habit. Your Grace, by the time you read this, you will have received reports of incidents in Sheffield, Leeds, and Newcastle. These operations were conducted under my authority, using intelligence I compiled during my 11 years of service to Blackthorn. I do not expect forgiveness, and I do not request it. What I request is that you understand the nature of the choice I was given. 3 years ago, Sir Reginald Hatch presented me with evidence that my younger brother, Thomas Aldridge, had embezzled Crown funds during his service in the Colonial Office. The evidence was genuine. The penalty was execution. Hatch offered an alternative. My cooperation in exchange for Thomas's life. I accepted. I have been providing intelligence on Blackthorn operations to Hatch's network since that day. I tell you this not to excuse my actions, but to illustrate a principle you have always claimed to understand. Every man has a pressure point. Every fortress has a door. You believed your security was impenetrable because you trusted me. You trusted me because I had served you faithfully for 11 years. And I had served you faithfully for 11 years because my brother had not yet been threatened. The moment he was, every year of loyalty became irrelevant. That is not weakness, Your Grace. That is the architecture of human nature, and no amount of power can override it. I will not be found. I have taken precautions. But I wanted you to hear this from me rather than from the men who will spend the coming weeks speculating about my motives. You were a good employer. In a different world, I would have remained a good soldier. This world does not permit such simplicity. Aldridge. Serafina set the letter down. The war room was silent. Lucien stood at the window. He had not moved during the time it took her to read. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and for a moment the two images, the man and his ghost, seemed to be having a conversation that required no words. A conversation about the fundamental nature of the thing he had spent 20 years building and the fundamental flaw that had been embedded in its foundation from the beginning. He had trusted Aldridge, not casually, not superficially. He had trusted him the way a man trusts the lock on his own front door. Completely. Unconsciously. With the deep, structural confidence of someone who has tested the mechanism 1,000 times and found it reliable and therefore stopped testing it because reliability had become indistinguishable from permanence. And that was the flaw. Reliability was never permanent. It was conditional. Every lock could be picked by someone who understood its mechanism well enough. Every loyalty could be broken by someone who found the right lever. Aldridge had not been weak. He had been human, and Lucien had made the cardinal error of treating human loyalty as though it were mechanical loyalty, predictable, consistent, immune to the pressures that bent and broke every other material in the world. He had built his empire on the assumption that control was absolute. And tonight, standing in a room full of red marks on a map and the letter of a man who had betrayed him out of love for his brother, Lucien confronted this possibility that absolute control was a fiction he had been telling himself since he was 14 years old, because the alternative, that the world was fundamentally ungovernable, that people were fundamentally unpredictable, that no amount of power could insulate you from the consequences of needing other human beings, was a truth too large to survive without changing everything about how he operated. "The attacks can be contained," Serafina said. He did not respond. "Lucien, the attacks can be contained, the steelworks can be rebuilt, the coal depot can be resupplied, the ship can be raised. These are material losses, expensive but recoverable. The real damage is political, and the real damage depends entirely on how we respond in the next 48 hours. Pemberton has already withdrawn. Pemberton is a weather vane. He points wherever the wind blows hardest. If we demonstrate strength, he will return. They all will." Demonstrate strength. The words came out flat. Mechanical. With what? My security apparatus has been compromised. My head of operations has defected. 3 of my most critical facilities are destroyed. And every ally I recruited at Westminster is currently receiving messages from Hatch's network explaining why Blackthorn is no longer a safe investment. Then we find new investments, new allies, new leverage. You're not listening. He turned from the window. His eyes were different. Not cold, not hot. Something in between. The temperature of metal when it has been heated past its tolerance and begins to deform. I trusted him. I trusted Aldridge with every secret this house contains, every patrol route, every supply chain vulnerability, every contingency plan. He sat in this room with us. He heard our strategies. He watched us build our case against Hatch. And every night he went home and transmitted everything he knew to the man we were trying to destroy. I know. Do you? Do you understand what that means? Not strategically, not tactically. What it means about the fundamental premise on which I have built everything I own. It means you trusted someone and they betrayed you. That is not a structural failure. It is a human inevitability. It is the same human inevitability that killed my father. The words hit the room like a detonation. Serafina went still. Lucien's breathing was controlled, but the effort of that control was visible now. The muscles in his jaw working, the tendons in his neck taut as cables, his hands at his sides, fingers flexing and straightening in a rhythm that was not conscious, the body processing what the mind refused to articulate fully. My father trusted his allies. They turned. My mother trusted her physician. He poisoned her. I trusted Aldridge. He sold my operations to the man who orchestrated my parents' deaths. The pattern is not coincidence. It is architecture. And the architect is not Hatch. The architect is the fundamental nature of human attachment itself. The moment you need someone, you create a vulnerability. The moment you trust someone, you hand them a weapon. And the only question is not whether they will use it, but when. That is fear talking. That is 20 years of evidence talking. It is fear. And I know the difference because I lived inside the same fear for a decade. After my father was destroyed, I trusted no one. Not a friend, not a landlord, not a shopkeeper who sold me bread. I lived in 7 countries, and I never once let another person close enough to hurt me. And do you know what I learned? Enlighten me. I learned that isolation does not protect you. It preserves you. There is a difference. A preserved thing does not grow. It does not adapt. It sits in its container and maintains its shape while the world outside changes into something it no longer recognizes. I was perfectly preserved for 10 years, and perfectly useless. I could not build anything because building requires other people. I could not fight anything because fighting requires allies. I could not change anything because change requires trust, and I had decided trust was a luxury I could not afford. And then I came back to London, and I sat in your dining room and listened to you describe the same network of men who destroyed my family. And you offered me an alliance, and I had to choose between the safety of isolation and the danger of trusting someone who could betray me the same way everyone had betrayed my father. She stepped closer. I chose the danger. Not because I believed you were trustworthy, because I believed the alternative was worse. Surviving alone is not surviving. It is waiting to die with your defenses intact. And I decided I would rather be destroyed by someone I chose to trust than preserved by a fear I did not choose to carry. Lucian stared at her. Aldridge betrayed you because he loved his brother more than he feared you. That is not a flaw in your system. That is a limitation of every system built on fear. Fear works until something stronger appears. And there is always something stronger. Love, desperation, grief. The things that make people unpredictable are the same things that make them human. You cannot eliminate the risk without eliminating the humanity. And if you eliminate the humanity, you do not have an empire. You have a machine, and machines break. People break too. Yes, but people can be rebuilt. Machines just stop. The clock on the mantel struck 8. Lucien looked at the reports on the desk. The map wall with its red marks. The letter from a man who had served him faithfully for 11 years and betrayed him for 3. The accumulated evidence of a world that refused to behave according to the principles he had imposed on it. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was different. Not softer, not warmer, stripped. The voice of a man standing in the wreckage of his own certainty, looking at the raw materials and trying to determine what, if anything, could be constructed from the ruins. What do you propose? Serafina pulled a chair to the desk and sat down. She spread the map of the Northern Territories in front of her and began marking locations with a pencil. We cannot rebuild the steelworks in time to maintain our leverage over Parliament, but we do not need the steelworks. We need the perception of the steelworks. The men who stood with us at Westminster did so because they believed Blackthorn was too powerful to challenge. If we allow the news of these attacks to reach London before we control the narrative, that perception collapses. So we control the narrative first. How? The press. The same weapon we used against Hatch. The attacks in the North are not industrial accidents. They are acts of terrorism orchestrated by a criminal conspiracy that we exposed at the Winter Council. The story is not Blackthorn is weakened. The story is Hatch's network struck back and Blackthorn survived. The first version makes us vulnerable. The second makes us sympathetic. And sympathy, in the hands of a competent strategist, is more powerful than steel. Lucien leaned against the desk. His arms crossed over his chest. The posture of a man evaluating a proposition he did not yet trust but could not dismiss. You want to use the attacks as evidence of Hatch's reach. I want to use the attacks as proof that our case at Westminster was not political theater. Hatch retaliated because we threatened him. Retaliation proves the threat was real. And if the threat was real, the evidence was real. And if the evidence was real, every man in Parliament who considered withdrawing his support now has a reason to recommit. Not because of loyalty, because the public is watching. And no politician survives being seen as complicit with the man who burned down factories and nearly drowned sailors in Newcastle Harbor. Bombs. Lucien studied her face. The pencil marks on the map. The strategic architecture she was constructing in real time from the rubble of his certainty. She was right. He knew she was right. And the knowledge carried a weight that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that the woman sitting across from him had just watched him confront the deepest fracture in his identity and had responded not with comfort, not with reassurance, not with the empty platitudes that passed for support among people who had never been truly broken, but with a plan. A clear, actionable, ruthless plan that took the worst thing that had ever happened to him and turned it into ammunition. She fought the way he fought, with her mind, with her will, with the absolute refusal to let destruction be the final word. But she fought for something he had forgotten existed, a future, not the preserved, controlled, hermetically sealed future he had been constructing for 20 years. A future that was messy and unpredictable and populated by human beings who could betray you or save you with equal probability and no advance warning. A future that required trust. And trust, as Aldridge's letter had demonstrated with surgical precision, was the one thing Lucien Ravenscar had never been able to manufacture, purchase, or command into existence. It could only be given. Do it, he said. Contact the press. Shape the narrative. Use everything. Everything? Aldridge's letter, the details of the attacks, the connection to Hatch, everything. Hold nothing back. Yeah? If we release Aldridge's letter, the public will know your security was compromised from within. That vulnerability could be exploited. It will be exploited regardless. The information is already in Hatch's network. Within days, it will leak through a dozen channels, and the version that reaches the public will be designed to maximize damage. If we release it first, we control the framing. A trusted officer, blackmailed into betrayal by a criminal conspiracy. The narrative shifts from Blackthorn's failure to Hatch's depravity. Serafina looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but close to it. The expression of a woman watching a man she thought she understood reveal a capacity she had not predicted. He was adapting, not retreating, not hardening, not sealing the cracks in his armor and pretending they did not exist. He was doing something far more difficult and far more dangerous. He was allowing the cracks to remain visible and building a new structure around them, using vulnerability as material rather than treating it as waste. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen him do. "There is one more thing," she said. "What?" "The affidavit Hatch mentioned at Westminster. The forgery charges against me. Even with the narrative shift, if those charges are filed, they create a legal front that divides our attention and gives Hatch's allies a weapon. I need to address it directly. I will not allow you to be arrested. You will not need to, because the affidavit is a lie, and I can prove it." Lucien's eyes narrowed. The travel documents. He said they were forged by a French intelligence operative. They were forged, but not by a French operative. They were forged by a British operative. A man named Garrett Silk, who worked for the Foreign Office, until he was quietly dismissed for unauthorized activities in 1884. Silk forged my documents as a personal favor, not a state operation. The distinction matters. Treason requires state involvement. Personal forgery is a civil offense. And Silk is currently living in Geneva, perfectly willing to testify that he acted alone, because I have been paying for his retirement for the past 6 years against exactly this kind of contingency. Lucien stared at her. "You have had a contingency in place for 6 years. I have had contingencies in place for every vulnerability I carry. My travel documents, my foreign contacts, my financial history, every potential accusation anticipated and prepared for. I did not survive 10 years of exile by being optimistic, Lucien. I survived by assuming that every weapon that could be used against me would be used against me, and by making sure I had a defense ready before the attack arrived." Something shifted in Lucien's face. A reconfiguration so subtle that only someone who had spent weeks studying his expressions in firelight and candlelight and the gray London dawn would have recognized it. He was looking at her the way he looked at blueprints, the way he looked at maps of territory he intended to claim, with the focused, absolute attention of a man who had identified something of immeasurable value and was calculating not how to acquire it, but how to deserve it. "You are extraordinary," he said. It was not a compliment, it was a diagnosis, delivered with the same clinical precision he brought to every other assessment. "I am prepared," she corrected. "Extraordinary implies talent. Preparation implies work. I prefer the one I can control. She stood. I will draft the press communications. You need to contact your northern managers and begin damage assessment. And we need to send someone to Geneva to secure Silk's testimony before Hatch's people learn he exists. Agreed. I will dispatch a team tonight. She gathered the documents and moved toward the door. She stopped at the threshold. Lucienne? Yes. Aldridge's letter. The part about every man having a pressure point. What about it? Oh, he was right. Everyone has a pressure point, including you. Hatch found Aldridge's. If he finds yours, the same thing happens. Everything you built, compromised by the one thing you cannot control. I am aware. Are you? Because standing in this room an hour ago, you told me that human attachment is the architect of vulnerability. And you were right. It is. The question is whether you treat that as a reason to retreat or a reason to fight harder. She held his gaze. Hatch blackmailed Aldridge because Aldridge loved his brother and Aldridge was alone. His love was a weakness because he had no one to protect it. No ally, no partner, no one standing beside him when Hatch came with his evidence and his threats. He faced that choice in isolation, and isolation is where fear wins. She stepped back into the room. You are not isolated anymore, and neither am I. That is either the greatest vulnerability we possess or the greatest strength, and the only thing that determines which one it becomes is whether we choose to use it. She left. Lucienne stood alone in the war room. The morning light had shifted, cold and gray and honest, the kind of light that did not flatter anything and did not hide anything and forced every object in its path to exist exactly as it was, without shadow, without softening, without the merciful darkness that made imperfection tolerable. He looked at the map wall. The red marks. Sheffield, Leeds, Newcastle. 3 wounds in the body of an empire he had spent 20 years building on the principle that absolute control was the only defense against a world designed to destroy the things you loved. Aldridge's letter lay on the desk, the handwriting of a man who had been loyal for 11 years and treacherous for 3, and both states had been equally. Genuine because human beings were not machines and loyalty was not a switch that stayed in one position forever. It moved. It responded to pressure. It bent under weight that exceeded its tolerance. And no amount of testing, no amount of surveillance, no amount of control could predict the moment when the weight became too much, because the weight was always something personal, something intimate, something that existed in the space between what a man was willing to sacrifice and what he was not. Lucian walked to the fireplace. He picked up the glass vial that still sat on the mantel. The arsenic vial. Hatch's first message. The weapon that had killed his mother and had been sent to remind him that everything he loved could be taken. He held it up to the gray morning light, and for the first time in 20 years, Lucian Ravenscar looked at the instrument of his mother's death and felt something other than rage. He felt the weight of a choice. He could rebuild his empire the way it had been built before. Harder, colder, more controlled. He could eliminate every vulnerability by eliminating every attachment. He could fire every man who had worked alongside Aldridge. He could sever every alliance built on trust and replace it with alliances built purely on economic coercion. He could retreat behind walls so thick that nothing human could penetrate them, and no betrayal could reach him, and no loss could touch him ever again. He could become the thing Hatch had always been, a mechanism, efficient, unfeeling, immune to the leverage of love because love had been surgically removed from the architecture. He could survive. Or he set the vial down. He walked to the desk. He sat in the chair where Serafina had been sitting. The wood was still warm. He could smell her perfume, faint, sharp, winter air over open water. The scent of a woman who had walked into his fortress carrying nothing but intelligence and grief and the reckless, irrational, strategically indefensible belief that the world could be fought alongside someone instead of alone. The choice was not between strength and weakness. The choice was between 2 kinds of survival, the kind that preserved what he was, and the kind that required becoming something he had never been. Lucienne Ravenscar had built an empire on control. Control had failed, not because it was flawed in principle, because it was flawed in practice. Because control required perfection, and perfection required the elimination of every variable, and the most dangerous variable in any system was the human heart. And the human heart could not be eliminated without eliminating the reason for building the empire in the first place. He had built Blackthorn to avenge his parents. He had maintained Blackthorn to punish the men who destroyed them. But somewhere in the past 6 weeks, standing beside a woman who threw inkwells at portraits and broke into sealed libraries and dismantled criminal conspiracies with the precision of a military campaign, the purpose had shifted. The vengeance remained. The punishment remained. But underneath them, growing in the dark like roots beneath stone, something else had taken hold. A reason to build that was not about destruction. A reason to fight that was not about the past. A reason to survive that required the presence of another human being in order to have any meaning at all. He opened the top drawer of the desk and removed a sheet of Blackthorn stationery. He dipped a pen in ink, and he wrote 3 lines in a handwriting that was nothing like Aldridge's disciplined military script and nothing like Hatch's elegant precision. It was the handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship by a father who loved poetry and a mother who wrote her son's name beside wildflowers in the margins of books. The note read, "To all Blackthorn operations, effective immediately. Commander Aldridge's security protocols are revoked and replaced. New protocols to follow under joint authority. Signed, Lucian Ravenscar, Duke of Blackthorn. Countersigned, Seraphina Vale." He stared at the 2 names on the page. Joint authority. In the entire history of the Ravenscar dynasty, no Duke of Blackthorn had ever shared operational authority with anyone. The title was singular. The power was singular. The name on every document, every order, every contract was one name, because singular authority meant singular accountability, and singular accountability meant no one could undermine a decision without first undermining the man who made it. Lucian was about to violate every principle his family had operated on for 200 years, not because Seraphina had asked, because Aldridge's betrayal had proven that singular authority was a myth. One man, no matter how powerful, was one pressure point, one target, one vulnerability wrapped in the illusion of invulnerability. The only defense against a system designed to exploit individual weakness was to stop being an individual. The only defense was trust. And trust, he was learning, was not a mechanism you could build or buy or command. It was a fall. You stepped off the edge and you either caught each other or you didn't. He folded the note. He rang for Hargrove. "Deliver this to Lady Vale. And Hargrove, Your Grace. When you return, pack my field equipment. We leave for Sheffield tonight. You intend to go north yourself, Your Grace? I intend to stand in the wreckage and let every worker, every manager, every ally, and every enemy see that Blackthorn does not govern from a distance. Not anymore." Hargrove took the note and left. Lucien sat alone in the war room. The vial of arsenic sat on the mantel, catching the gray light. The letter from Aldridge lay on the desk. The map wall showed the wounds in his empire, and somewhere in the east wing of the palace, Seraphina was unfolding a note that contained 2 names where there had always been one, and understanding what it meant and making a choice of her own. Outside, London ground forward under iron skies, indifferent and enormous. And inside Blackthorn Palace, a man who had spent 20 years becoming a fortress was doing the most dangerous thing a fortress could do, opening the gates. Not because the siege was over, because it had just begun, and the only way through it was a direction he had never traveled before. Forward, together, into a war where the most devastating weapon was not steel or secrets or economic leverage, but the terrifying, annihilating, uncontrollable act of allowing another person to matter more than survival itself. Lucien stood. He straightened his coat. He left the room. And behind him, on the desk, Aldridge's letter caught a gust of wind from the open window and slid to the floor. The last line faced upward in the gray morning light. This world does not permit such simplicity. The wind turned the page. The words disappeared, but the war they had started was just beginning. The road north was a black wound cut through frozen English countryside. Lucien's carriage moved fast, faster than safety permitted. Iron wheels cracking ice on roads that had not been maintained since the last frost, because the county council responsible for maintenance owed Blackthorn money and had been neglecting their duties as a form of passive resistance that Lucian had tolerated until tonight. Tonight he did not tolerate anything. Tonight the horses ran until foam streaked their flanks, and the driver's hands bled through his gloves from gripping the reins against the cold. Seraphina sat across from him in the carriage. She had not argued when he said they were going north together. She had changed into traveling clothes, dark wool, heavy boots, a coat lined with fur that she buttoned to the throat with the efficiency of a woman who had dressed for survival in colder places than England. The leather case sat between them on the seat, lighter now, emptied of the evidence they had deployed at Westminster, but filled with new documents, press drafts, financial projections, damage assessments compiled from the reports still arriving every hour. They did not speak for the first 30 miles. The silence was not empty. It was loaded. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have said everything that matters and are now sitting inside the consequences, waiting to see whether the architecture holds. At the 50-mile mark, a rider appeared on the road ahead. Blackthorn colors. The man's horse was blown, sides heaving, breath erupting in white clouds against the black air. He pulled alongside the carriage and shouted through the window, "Your Grace, message from Sheffield. The local magistrate has seized the steelworks under emergency authority. He is claiming the fire was caused by negligent management and is ordering Blackthorn operations suspended pending investigation." Lucien's eyes did not change, but the muscles along his forearm contracted visibly beneath his sleeve, a response so involuntary it bypassed every layer of control he had spent 2 decades constructing. The magistrate in Sheffield was a man named Grindle, a career bureaucrat who had held his position for 12 years through the simple expedient of never challenging anyone powerful enough to remove him. Grindle did not make independent decisions. Grindle made decisions that were communicated to him by men with more authority and less visibility. "Who gave the order?" Lucien said. "Unknown, Your Grace, but the magistrate cited correspondence from the Home Office." "The Home Office?" "Yes, Your Grace." Lucien looked at Serafina. She was already thinking. He could see it in the way her eyes moved, tracking invisible patterns the way a mathematician tracks equations, not on paper, but in the space between observation and conclusion. "Hatch is in custody," she said. "He cannot issue orders directly, but his network is intact. Someone in the Home Office is still taking instructions. The question is who? The question is how fast they are moving. Seizing the steelworks under emergency authority is a legal maneuver. It removes the site from Blackthorn control and places it under government jurisdiction. If they do the same with Leeds and Newcastle, they can freeze your northern operations entirely. No production, no revenue, no leverage. They are dismantling me piece by piece. What? They are trying. The difference between trying and succeeding is time. And right now, time is the only asset we have that they cannot steal." Lucien turned back to the rider. "Ride ahead to Sheffield. Find Blackthorn's local superintendent, a man named Marsh. Tell him to do nothing, accept nothing, sign nothing. If the magistrate presents paperwork, Marsh is to request a delay for legal review. Every hour of delay is an hour we can use. Go." The rider vanished into the darkness. The carriage pushed forward. They reached Sheffield at 4 in the morning. The steelworks was still burning, not the main structure. That had collapsed hours ago. A skeleton of iron beams twisted into shapes that looked like the bones of something enormous that had died in agony. But the auxiliary buildings were still alight, flames licking through shattered windows, throwing orange light across the snow-covered ground, and the faces of the people who had gathered in the cold to watch the heart of their town die. Lucien stepped down from the carriage and felt the heat on his face from 50 yards away. The air tasted of ash and scorched metal and something chemical, the accelerant, still burning in pockets where the fire crews had not yet reached. Around the perimeter, exhausted men in soot-stained clothes worked pumps and hauled water in a battle they had already lost but refused to abandon, because abandoning it meant acknowledging that the thing they had built their lives around was gone. He stood there, the Duke of Blackthorn, owner of the wreckage, architect of the empire that this furnace and these men and these buildings had served for 15 years. He stood in the snow in his black traveling coat with ash falling around him like gray snow, and he looked at the destruction with eyes that registered every detail, because that was what he did. He registered, he cataloged, he calculated the cost of rebuilding, the timeline, the supply chain implications, the political leverage lost, the human capital destroyed, 8 men dead. The number had risen to 10 by the latest report. 2 more dying in a makeshift infirmary set up in a warehouse 3 blocks east. 10 men. He could rebuild a factory. He could not rebuild 10 men. A foreman approached. A thick man in his 50s with hands scarred from decades of metalwork and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same material he shaped for a living. "Your Grace, we did not expect you. What is the current situation?" "Jeg er bit spimbom mit samme seat. Main foundry, gone. Rolling mill, gone. The casting house is still standing, but the interior is gutted. Stockyard survived because the wind shifted at 2 in the morning, or we would have lost that too. We have 60 men working the pumps, another 40 treating the injured. The dead are laid out in the Methodist Hall on Broad Street. The magistrate, Grindle, where is he? At the town hall. He arrived 3 hours ago with 2 clerks and a constable. He posted a notice on the gate saying operations are suspended under government authority. The foreman's jaw tightened. Your Grace, these men need to know what happens next. They have families. They have rent due. If the works are shut down, the works are not shut down. I am here. And no magistrate in England closes a blackthorn operation while I am standing on its grounds. The foreman looked at him. In the firelight, Lucien saw something shift behind the man's eyes. Not hope exactly, something rawer. The look of a man who had spent the night watching his world burn and had just been told that the person responsible for that world was present and accounted for and angry enough to do something about it. What do you need from us, Your Grace? Keep the pumps running, get the injured to the infirmary, and tell your men that every worker displaced by this fire will receive full wages until the works are rebuilt. Every family that lost someone tonight will receive a pension. I will announce it publicly at first light. That will cost. I know what it will cost. Do it. The foreman nodded and disappeared into the chaos. Lucien turned to find Serafina already moving toward the warehouse infirmary. She walked through the smoke and snow with the focused urgency of someone who understood that crisis demanded presence, not observation. He watched her push through the infirmary door and disappear inside, and he felt something contract in his chest that had nothing to do with the smoke. She was doing what he should have done first, going to the injured. He had gone to the foreman, the operational leader, the man who managed the machinery, because Lucien's first instinct, always in every crisis, was to address the system, the structure, the mechanism that produced outcomes. People were components of that mechanism, important components, valued components, but components nonetheless to be managed and maintained and replaced when damaged. Serafina's first instinct was to go to the people, not because she was softer, not because she was less strategic, because she understood something that Lucien was only now beginning to comprehend through the smoke and the ash and the sound of men dying 3 blocks east. The mechanism existed to serve the people, not the other way around. He followed her to the infirmary. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed into a field hospital. Cots lined the walls. Lanterns hung from ceiling beams. A local physician and 3 nurses moved between patients with the grim efficiency of people operating beyond exhaustion on nothing but duty and adrenaline. The smell was terrible. Burned flesh and carbolic acid and the metallic undertone of blood that had been exposed to heat. Serafina knelt beside a cot where a young man lay with his torso wrapped in soaked bandages. His face was gray. His breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps that sounded like paper tearing. His hands were burned so badly the skin had fused to the fabric of his work gloves. She held one of those hands. The young man's eyes opened, glazed, unfocused. He looked at her without recognition. "You are safe," she said. "You are being cared for. Do not try to speak." His mouth moved anyway, a whisper so faint it barely disturbed the air. "My wife. Someone needs to tell my wife." "What is her name, Mike?" "Margaret. She lives on Elm Row, number 14. She is expecting our first." Serafina's grip on his hand tightened. Her face did not change. The discipline it took to maintain that composure while holding the hand of a dying man whose wife was expecting. Their first child was a kind of strength that had nothing to do with power or strategy or the architecture of empires. "I will make sure she knows," Serafina said. Lucien stood in the doorway and watched. Something inside him, something that had been shifting and cracking and restructuring for weeks, completed its transformation in that moment. Not with a dramatic revelation, not with a sudden epiphany, with the quiet, devastating recognition that the woman kneeling beside that cot was showing him what it looked like to lead without armor, to walk into the worst room in the building and stay there, to hold the hand that hurt the most because holding it was the point, not the strategy, not the mechanism. The point. He had built an empire to avenge his parents, She had walked into a warehouse to hold a stranger's hand, and both acts were driven by the same engine, the refusal to let suffering be invisible, the insistence that loss mattered, that the people consumed by the machinery of power were not acceptable casualties, but the reason the machinery existed in the first place. He had known this once, as a boy, standing in the hallway listening to his father read poetry. His father had known it, had built schools and improved factories because he believed that wealth carried obligation and power carried responsibility. And the measure of a man was not what he controlled, but what he protected. They had killed his father for that belief, and Lucien had spent 20 years replacing it with something harder, something that worked, something that could not be destroyed by the same methods that had destroyed his father. But tonight, in a warehouse full of burned men and the sound of a young worker asking someone to tell his pregnant wife, Lucien understood that his father had not been wrong. His father had been alone. And alone, that belief was a vulnerability. But shared, defended, fought for by more than one person, that belief was the most dangerous thing in England, because it gave people something worth dying for that was not revenge. He crossed the infirmary and knelt beside Serafina. He looked at the young man on the cot. "What is your name?" "Thomas Bright, sir." "Thomas, I am Lucien Ravenscar. This happened because men who want to destroy me chose to destroy you instead. That is my failure, not yours, and I am going to fix it." The young man's eyes focused for the first time. He looked at the Duke of Blackthorn kneeling on a dirty warehouse floor in a coat that cost more than his annual wages, and something passed between them that was not gratitude and not anger and not forgiveness, but something older. The recognition of one human being by another in a moment where pretense was impossible, and the only currency that mattered was presence. "Fix the works, sir," Thomas Bright whispered. "That is all we need. Just fix the works." "I will." Lucien stood. His knees were wet from the warehouse floor. His coat was stained with ash. His hands carried the faint chemical smell of the bandages he had touched when he knelt. He walked outside into the cold. The fire was dying. The pumps had done their work. What remained of the steelwork stood against the pre-dawn sky like a monument to the cost of power. Twisted iron and collapsed stone, and the ghosts of 10 men who would never walk home again. Serafina appeared beside him. "Thomas Bright's wife," he said. "Elm Row, number 14. "I will go myself, at first light." "No, we go together." She looked at him. "Together," he repeated. The word tasted foreign in his mouth, like a language he was relearning after years of disuse. But it was the right word, the only word. The word that had been missing from his vocabulary since the night his father died, and he decided that the only reliable unit of power was one. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Sheffield. Lucien and Serafina walked through streets coated in ash to the town hall where Magistrate Grindle had established his temporary authority. The building was small, civic, built in the previous century with pretensions of grandeur that the intervening decades had not been kind to. 2 constables stood outside looking cold and uncomfortable and entirely unprepared for what was about to walk through their door. Lucien entered without knocking. Grindle sat behind a desk that was not his, wearing a chain of office that seemed to weigh more than his courage. He was a small man with the rounded features of someone who had spent his career avoiding confrontation and was now discovering that confrontation had found him regardless. 2 clerks flanked him, papers spread before them, inkwells and seals at the ready. The magistrate stood when Lucien entered. The motion was involuntary, the body's response to a presence that triggered every survival instinct the human nervous system possessed. Grindle's face went the color of old snow. "Your Grace, we were not informed you would be. Who gave you the order to seize my steelworks?" The Home Office issued a directive citing emergency powers under the Industrial Safety Act of... "I asked who, not which act, not which office. Who?" "A name, Grindle. I want a name." The magistrate's throat moved, a swallow so pronounced it was almost audible. His eyes darted to the clerks, who had both developed a sudden and intense interest in the papers in front of them. The directive came from Undersecretary Fairchild. "Edmund Fairchild." "Yes, Your Grace." Lucien turned to Serafina. She was already cataloging the name, cross-referencing it against the network they had mapped in the war room at Blackthorn Palace. Fairchild, a mid-level Home Office bureaucrat, not on their primary list, not connected to Hatch through any documented channel, which meant one of 2 things. Either Fairchild was an unknown node in Hatch's network, or Fairchild had been activated recently, a sleeper asset held in reserve for exactly this kind of contingency. Grindle, Lucien said. His voice was quiet, the quiet that made men step backward. You have two choices. The first is to rescind the seizure order, withdraw your constables, and return to whatever it is you normally do when you are not being used as a weapon against me. In exchange, I will forget that this happened, and your career will continue in its current unremarkable trajectory. And the second? The second is that I contact the 4 newspapers currently preparing stories about the conspiracy we exposed at Westminster, and I add your name to the list of officials who assisted in the retaliation against Blackthorn. By tomorrow evening, every literate person in England will know that Magistrate Grindle of Sheffield helped a criminal network shut down the factory that employs 12,000 people in this town. How do you think those 12,000 people will feel about that, Grindle? How do you think they will express those feelings? Because I have been outside tonight, I have seen their faces, and I can tell you with complete certainty that they are not in a forgiving mood. The magistrate's face passed through several colors in rapid succession, white to gray to a flushed, mottled red, that suggested his cardiovascular system was protesting the demands being placed on it. Your Grace, I was simply following orders from... Men who follow orders without questioning them are not officials. They are furniture, and I do not negotiate with furniture. Rescind the order. Now. Grindle looked at his clerks. The clerks looked at the desk. The desk offered no assistance. The seizure order is rescinded, Grindle said. In writing, signed and sealed, before I leave this room. The clerks moved with the sudden, desperate efficiency of men who had identified the winning side and were scrambling to reach it. Within 3 minutes, a signed document sat on the desk. Lucien picked it up, read it, folded it, and placed it inside his coat. One more thing, Grindle. Your Grace? Undersecretary Fairchild. How did his directive reach you? By special courier. Last night. Do you still have the original document? Yes. It is in the correspondence file. Give it to me. Another scramble. Another document. Lucien held it up to the light from the window and studied the handwriting, the seal, the paper stock. Government issue. The seal was authentic. The signature matched Fairchild's known hand, but the paper was wrong. Lucien ran his thumb across the edge. Standard government stationery used a specific weight and texture mandated by procurement regulations that had not changed in 20 years. This paper was close, but not identical, slightly heavier, a different mill, the kind of discrepancy that 99 people out of 100 would miss entirely, and that Lucien noticed because he had spent his life studying the materials from which power was constructed, and paper was one of them. The directive was forged, not by Fairchild, by someone who had access to his seal and enough knowledge of government stationery to produce a convincing imitation, but not a perfect one. Hatch's network was not just surviving his arrest, it was operating independently, generating forged government orders, deploying them through legitimate channels, using the machinery of the state against Blackthorn with a sophistication that suggested planning far deeper than a contingency activated in response to Westminster. This had been prepared months ago, maybe years. Lucien looked at Serafina. She had reached the same conclusion. He could see it in her eyes, the rapid-fire calculation, the reassessment of scale, the recognition that they were not fighting the remnants of a dismantled network, but the fully operational second layer of a system designed to survive the destruction of its visible components. We need to get back to London, she said. Not yet. There is something I need to do first. Was. He walked out of the town hall into the gray Sheffield morning. The streets were filling now. Workers, families, people who had spent the night watching the steelworks burn and were emerging into daylight to assess the damage to their lives. They lined the sidewalks and gathered on corners and stood in doorways, and when they saw the Duke of Blackthorn walking among them, the murmur that passed through the crowd was not the sound of deference or fear. It was the sound of people waiting to be told that someone was in charge. Lucien stopped in the middle of the main street. He did not climb onto a platform. He did not call for attention. He simply stopped and stood still. And within 30 seconds, every person in visual range had turned to face him because he was Lucien Ravenscar, and his stillness was louder than most men's shouting. My name is Ravenscar. Most of you know that. Some of you work for me. All of you depend on what this steelworks produces. And last night, Men who want to destroy me burned it to the ground. Silence. Absolute. The kind that comes when hundreds of people stop breathing at the same time. They killed 10 of your people. 10 men who did nothing except show up for a night shift. 10 men who had families and wages and lives that mattered more than any business dispute or political war. And they were killed because someone decided that hurting me was worth more than their lives. His voice carried down the street without effort. Not raised, not projected. Simply present. With the authority of a man who had spent 20 years making the air itself obey him. I'm not going to stand here and promise you justice. Justice is a word politicians use when they want you to be patient while they do nothing. What I'm going to promise you is this. Every worker displaced by this fire will receive full wages starting today. Every family that lost someone will receive a pension for life. And the men who did this, the men who decided your lives were acceptable collateral in their war against me, will answer for it. Not in a courtroom where lawyers negotiate reduced sentences. Not in a parliamentary hearing where politicians make speeches. They will answer to me, personally, and I do not negotiate. He paused. The steelworks will be rebuilt, bigger, better, faster than anyone thinks possible, because that is what Blackthorn does. We do not break. And the people who burn this factory are about to learn what happens when you attack something that refuses to die. He turned and walked back toward the carriage. Behind him, walked. The silence held for 3 seconds. Then it broke. Not into applause, into something rougher. A sound that came from the gut rather than the hands. The sound of 12,000 people exhaling at the same time and discovering that the breath carried something they had lost during the night. Belief. Not in Lucian Ravenscar as a good man, not in his kindness or his compassion or his moral character. Belief in his rage. Belief in his refusal to accept what had been done. Belief that the man who owned their factory was angry enough and powerful enough and stubborn enough to drag their world back from the ashes through sheer force of will. It was not love. It was not loyalty. It was something more primal. The recognition by a wounded community that the most dangerous predator in their ecosystem was on their side. And right now, that was enough. Inside the carriage heading south toward London, Serafina unfolded the forged Home Office directive and studied it by the thin gray light coming through the window. Fairchild's seal, but not Fairchild's paper. Someone in Hatch's network has access to government seals. Not just one department. If they can forge Home Office directives convincingly enough to fool a magistrate, they can forge directives from any ministry. Which means the legal attacks will continue. Seizure orders, investigation notices, tax audits. Every bureaucratic weapon the government possesses turned against Blackthorn through forged authority. We cannot fight forgeries one at a time. For every directive we challenge, they will issue 3 more. The system is too large and too slow to distinguish real orders from fabricated ones in time to prevent damage. Then we do not fight the forgeries, we fight the source. The source is Hatch, and Hatch is in custody. Hatch is in custody, his network is not. And his network has been operating for 30 years. It does not require his direct involvement. It has its own momentum, its own leadership structure. Removing Hatch was like removing the head of a snake that has already laid its eggs. The carriage rocked through a frozen pothole. Lucien braced against the wall. His ribs ached from a bruise he had acquired climbing through the steelworks wreckage earlier that morning. A beam had shifted and caught him across the side before he could move. He had said nothing about it. Pain was information, not an event. You processed it and continued. We need to identify the secondary leadership, Serafina said. Someone is coordinating these operations. The attacks, the forged directives, the legal maneuvers. Hatch built a system that could function without him, but every system has a central node. A person who makes decisions when the primary authority is compromised. Aldridge might know. Aldridge is gone. Wosham. Aldridge left a letter. In that letter, he described being recruited by Hatch 3 years ago. He described the blackmail mechanism, but he also described receiving instructions, regular communications, coded messages delivered through intermediaries. Those intermediaries are the connective tissue of the network. If we can identify them, we can trace them to the secondary leader. Voss decoded the communications between Hatch and Waverly. He can decode Aldridge's as well. If Aldridge kept any of his instructions, or if Voss can intercept the channels used to deliver them, Aldridge said he would not be found. I am not looking for Aldridge. I'm looking for the system that operated him. The couriers, the dead drops, the communication protocols. Aldridge was a component. Components connect to other components, and every connection is a thread we can pull. Serafina set the forged directive on the seat and looked at Lucien with an expression he was beginning to recognize as something new in their partnership. Not admiration, not calculation, something in between. The look of a strategist watching another strategist evolve in real time, adapting to conditions that should have been catastrophic, and instead becoming more precise under pressure rather than less. He was not retreating into control. He was expanding beyond it, using the same analytical ferocity he had always possessed, but directing it toward connection rather than isolation, seeking allies rather than subordinates, building a response that was collaborative rather than singular. The man who had entered the Winter Council believing he could force the world to obey through economic coercion alone was becoming something more complicated and more dangerous. A leader who understood that the most resilient structures were not the ones built to withstand pressure, but the ones built to distribute it. They reached London by early afternoon. The city was buzzing, newspaper boys on every corner. The morning editions had carried the story of the Westminster confrontation, and the evening editions were already being typeset with reports of the northern attacks. Serafina's press strategy was working. The narrative taking shape across London was not Blackthorn weakened, but conspiracy strikes back. Hatch's name appeared in headlines alongside words like terrorism and sabotage and criminal network. The public, it turned out, did not need much encouragement to turn against a man who burned down factories and nearly drowned sailors. But the political situation was fracturing. Hargrove met them at the palace gates with reports that had accumulated during their absence. Pemberton had not only withdrawn his cooperation with the inquiry, but had publicly questioned the validity of the evidence presented at Westminster. 2 other council members had followed suit. The Home Secretary had issued a statement calling for calm and deliberation, which in political language meant delay. And Fairchild, the Undersecretary whose seal had been used on the forged directive, had been found dead in his office that morning. Apparent suicide. A note, a pistol, the usual staging. Lucien read the report in the entrance hall without removing his coat. Fairchild is dead. Convenient, Serafina said. More than convenient. If Fairchild was an unwitting participant, his death eliminates the only person who could confirm the directive was forged. The investigation will conclude that Fairchild issued the order himself as part of a personal vendetta or mental breakdown. The network remains invisible. And if he was a knowing participant, then his death eliminates a liability. Either way, the network cleans up after itself. He walked to the war room. Serafina followed. The maps on the walls now carried new marks, new red lines, new annotations. Sheffield, Leeds, Newcastle, Fairchild, a web of destruction spreading across the country like cracks in glass. Voss had left a stack of decoded messages on the desk. Lucien rifled through them, his eyes moving with the speed of a man who had been reading intelligence reports since he was 19 and could extract critical information from a document the way a surgeon extracted bullets. Fast, precise, aware that time was the enemy. He stopped on the 3rd page. His breathing changed, a subtle shift, the kind of thing no one would notice unless they had spent weeks memorizing the rhythm of his respiratory patterns in candlelight and firelight, and the gray light of English mornings. Serafina noticed. What? Lucien set the page on the desk. His finger pointed to a decoded passage. Voss intercepted this 2 hours ago. A message routed through 3 intermediaries, originating from a location in central London. The recipient is unknown. The content references operational coordination for what it calls Phase 3. Phase 3. Phase 1 was the Westminster assassination attempt. Phase 2 was the northern attacks. Phase 3 is described in one sentence. He read the sentence aloud. His voice was flat, drained of everything except the information itself. Secure the Vale asset. Transport to secondary location. Await further instructions. The room went cold. Serafina stared at the page. The words sat there in Voss's neat transcription, black ink on white paper, carrying a weight that no combination of letters should have been able to produce. Secure the Vale asset. Her. She was the next target. Not through legal channels. not through forged directives or parliamentary maneuvers, through direct action, kidnapping, removal. The same blunt instrument that powerful men had been using against inconvenient women for centuries, dressed up in operational language to make it sound like logistics rather than violence. Lucien stood up from the desk. His body had changed, not in any visible way. He was standing in the same position, wearing the same coat, occupying the same physical space. But the energy emanating from him had shifted into a frequency that Serafina had never encountered in 6 weeks of close observation. It was beyond anger, beyond the cold, controlled fury she had seen at Westminster, beyond the devastated grief she had witnessed when he spoke about his parents. This was something biological, something that existed below the level of conscious thought, in the ancient wiring that governed survival responses in moments when the thing you would die for was directly threatened. His pupils had dilated. His breathing had slowed to a rate that suggested his body was conserving oxygen for sustained physical exertion. His hands had gone still at his sides, not clenched, not relaxed, held in the neutral readiness of a man whose muscles were primed to act on instructions that had not yet been issued by a brain still calculating the optimal form of violence. He was terrifying, not because he was out of control, because he was in perfect control, and the thing being controlled was enormous. "How old is this intercept, Yigazun?" he said. 2 hours. The message references transport to a secondary location. That implies a primary location has already been identified. They know she is here, in this palace. He turned to Serafina. "How many exits does this building have?" "Lucien, how many exits?" "Wait. 7. The main gate, the east service entrance, the west garden, the kitchen delivery. All of them are known to Aldridge. All of them are compromised." He crossed to the window and looked out at the grounds. The December afternoon was fading, shadows spreading across the frozen garden like stains. "We need to move. Tonight. Before they position their people." "Move where?" "The northern estates, Ravenscar Keep. The original family stronghold. It predates the London Palace by 2 centuries. Stone walls 8 feet thick, 1 road in, 1 road out. And Aldridge never had access to its security layout because I never trusted anyone with that information. I maintained it myself." "You maintained the security of a northern fortress yourself. Every lock, every passage, every escape route. I have been preparing Ravenscar Keep since I was 20 years old, not as a home, as a fallback position, the place I would retreat to if London became untenable. You built a fortress inside your fortress. I built a place where the last stand happens, if it comes to that." Serafina looked at him. The man standing in front of her was not the same man who had sat in this room 3 days ago declaring that human attachment was the architect of vulnerability. That man had been speaking from theory. This man was speaking from the white-hot center of an experience that confirmed the theory absolutely. He was vulnerable. He was exposed. The thing he cared about most in the world was directly threatened, and the fear of losing it was rewriting his operational priorities in real time. And instead of retreating from the vulnerability, he was reorganizing his entire strategic posture around protecting it. He was not eliminating the weakness. He was fortifying it. "Hargrove?" Lucien N. called. The old valet materialized as though he had been waiting in the molecular structure of the hallway for precisely this summons. "Prepare the armored carriage. Provisions for 5 days. Weapons. Medical supplies. We leave for Ravenscar Keep within the hour." "The full household, Your Grace?" "No, skeleton staff. You. 4 guards I select personally. No one else enters the keep. And Lady Vale? Lady Vale goes nowhere without me. From this moment until I say otherwise, she is within arm's reach at all times. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." Hargrove vanished. Lucien turned back to the desk. He gathered the decoded messages, Aldridge's letter, the forged Home Office directive, the financial documents, and placed them in a leather case. He moved with the focused, economical precision of a man who had rehearsed this contingency in his mind 1,000 times and was now executing it with the mechanical efficiency that rehearsal produced. Serafina watched him. "Lucien," he stopped. "We are not running. No, we are repositioning. There is no difference if the enemy controls the narrative. The moment Blackthorn Palace goes dark, Hatch's network will tell London that the Duke has fled. The allies who stayed with us will interpret retreat as defeat. Pemberton will abandon us completely. The press will pivot, and every advantage we built at Westminster evaporates. I am aware. Then we cannot leave London. We cannot stay. That intercept described an operation to take you by force. The palace security has been compromised by a man who designed it. Every guard rotation, every entrance, every defensive position is known to the enemy. Staying here is not courage. It is theater. And I will not perform bravery while the people I am trying to protect are taken from me. Then we split the operation. Lucian stopped packing. We split the operation, Serafina repeated. She pulled the map of England toward her and pointed. I go to Ravenscar Keep with your guards. Visible departure, armored carriage. A clear signal that the Duchess of Blackthorn is relocating to the family stronghold under heavy protection. The network will track my movement. They will redirect their operational resources northward. They will focus on the keep. And I? Oswamt itim ishumain. You stay in London? Visible. Public. Attending sessions. Meeting allies. Maintaining the pressure on Hatch's network from the political center. The narrative is not retreat. The narrative is strategic deployment. The Duke holds the capital, while the Duchess secures the northern fortress. 2 fronts, 2 targets. Their resources divided. You want me to let you travel 200 miles through hostile territory while every asset Hatch's network possesses is trying to find you. I want you to trust me to survive a journey through a country I navigated alone for 10 years before I met you. That was different. How? You were not mine then. The words filled the room. Serafina looked at him. The carriage was being loaded in the courtyard below. The sound of harnesses and iron-shod hooves on cobblestone drifted through the window. The December light was failing. In 20 minutes, the city would be dark. I was always mine, Serafina said quietly. And I am choosing to do this, not because you cannot protect me, because this is how we win. Together does not mean side by side, Lucy. It means working toward the same objective from positions of maximum effectiveness. You are most effective in London. I am most effective drawing their fire. You are using yourself as bait. I am using myself as a strategic asset, the same way I have been used my entire life, except this time I am the one deciding how. His jaw worked, the muscle flexing and releasing in a rhythm that matched his pulse. She could see the war behind his eyes, the collision between the part of him that understood she was right and the part that had decided 6 weeks ago that losing her was the one outcome he would burn the world to prevent. The strategic mind said, let her go. The animal underneath said, never. And for 10 seconds, standing in the war room of Blackthorn Palace, with decoded intercepts on the desk and the sound of an armored carriage being prepared in the courtyard, Lucian Ravenscar experienced the full devastating weight of what it meant to love someone in a world that used love as a weapon. He could hold her close and lose the war, or he could let her go and win it. Take 6 guards, he said. Not 4. 6. And take Voss. I want real-time communication between the keep and London. If a single unknown rider appears on that road, I want to know about it before he reaches the gate. Agreed. And Serafina. Yes, hit. If they breach the keep, if the walls fail and the guards fall and there is no way out. You do not wait for rescue. You take the passage beneath the North Tower and you run. You run and you do not stop and you do not look back. Because I will come for you. I will always come for you. But I need you alive when I arrive. Boy, here's Sisa. She stepped forward. She placed her hand flat against his chest. Beneath her palm, his heart was hammering with a violence that contradicted every ounce of composure on his face. I will be alive, she said. I will be alive, and I will be furious, and I will be waiting for you to finish what we started. He covered her hand with his. They stood like that for 5 seconds. Then she turned, picked up the leather case, and walked out of the war room. Lucian listened to her footsteps descend the staircase. He listened to the courtyard door open and close. He listened to the carriage door slam, and the driver call to the horses, and the iron wheels begin their grinding journey north through the frozen streets of London. He stood at the window and watched the carriage disappear into the December darkness. Then he turned back to the empty room, the maps, the decoded messages, The red marks showing the wounds in his empire. The absence of her, filling the space like smoke, like the chemical taste of the Sheffield fire, like the residue of arsenic in a glass vial that sat on the mantel, catching the last gray light of a day that had started in a burning factory, was ending with the woman he loved rolling toward a fortress 200 miles away, while an invisible army moved through the darkness between them. His hand closed around the edge of the desk. The wood creaked. He released it. He sat down. He opened the decoded messages, and he began to hunt. Because somewhere in the web of intermediaries and coded communications and forged government orders, there was a name, a single name. The person running Hatch's network in his absence. The person who had orchestrated the northern attacks and ordered the seizure of the steelworks and killed Fairchild and sent the message about securing the Vale asset. One name. And when Lucien found it, the thing he would do to the person attached to that name would make everything he had done at Westminster look like a polite disagreement. The clock struck 6. London went dark. And 200 miles north, on a frozen road cutting through countryside that had belonged to the Ravenscar family for 2 centuries, an armored carriage carrying Serafina Vale moved through the night toward a fortress built to withstand sieges. Behind the carriage, at a distance calculated to avoid detection by the guards riding alongside, 14 riders in unmarked coats followed in silence. They had been waiting since noon. And the person who had dispatched them was not in a prison cell beneath Westminster. The person who had dispatched them was sitting in a drawing room in Mayfair, drinking tea, reading the evening edition of the Times, and smiling at the headline that described the Duke of Blackthorn's brave stand in Sheffield. A person whose name appeared nowhere in Hatch's decoded communications. A person Lucien trusted. A person Serafina had never suspected. A person who had been standing beside them from the very beginning. Voss cracked it at 11 minutes past midnight. The Austrian mathematician emerged from the basement for the first time in 4 days, carrying a single sheet of paper covered in his cramped, obsessive handwriting. His eyes were bloodshot. His shirt was buttoned wrong. He smelled like ink and cold coffee, and the particular staleness that accumulates around a human being who has been solving a puzzle too consuming to permit basic hygiene. He placed the paper on Lucien's desk without ceremony. "The secondary communication channel," Voss said. His accent made every English word sound like it had been translated through 3 languages before arriving, not routed through Hatch's known intermediaries. A separate system, older, more careful. The encryption was layered, 3 ciphers nested inside each other, each requiring a different key. The outer layer was military standard. The middle layer was commercial. A banking cipher I recognized from Rothschild correspondence I decoded in Vienna. But the inner layer was personal. A substitution cipher based on a private text. A book. I needed to identify which book before I could break it. Which book? A first edition of Marcus Vale's political memoirs, published privately in 1876. Only 12 copies printed. The cipher uses page numbers, line numbers, and word positions as substitution keys. Lucien's blood went still. Marcus Vale, Serafina's father, his memoirs used as the key to a cipher that operated the deepest layer of Hatch's network. The implication was a blade pressed flat against his throat. The decoded messages reveal a correspondent identified only by initials, Voss continued. LP. The correspondent has been issuing operational orders through this channel for at least 18 months. The orders include the timing of the northern attacks, the deployment of the forged Home Office directive, the elimination of Undersecretary Fairchild, and the current instruction to intercept Lady Vale's carriage en route to Ravenscar Keep. LP. Lady Pemberton. The name detonated in Lucien's skull. Lady Pemberton, wife of Lord Pemberton, the woman who had sat beside her husband at every social function Lucien had attended for the past decade. The woman who had recommended the physician to his mother. The woman whose smile carried the warmth of a closed trap. Not Pemberton, not the weak, purchasable politician who bent with every wind. His wife. The woman behind the man behind the curtain, operating a communication network encrypted with the private writings of a man she had helped destroy 20 years ago, using his words as the instrument of her continued power with a cruelty so refined it transcended malice and entered the territory of art. Lucien stood up from the desk. His body moved before his mind finished processing. He was at the door, in the corridor, descending the staircase, crossing the entrance hall with strides so long and so fast that Hargrove had to run to keep pace. The valet had served Blackthorn for 4 decades and had never run inside the palace. Tonight he ran because the look on Lucian's face was the look of a man who had located the source of every loss he had ever suffered and was moving toward it with the inevitability of a natural disaster. Your Grace, the carriage is not prepared. I do not need a carriage. I need a horse, the fastest horse in the stable. And I need a pistol. And I need you to send a rider north, faster than anything we have ever sent, to warn Seraphina that the 14 riders following her carriage were dispatched by Lady Pemberton, and that the ambush will come before she reaches the keep. Hargrove's face went white. Move, Hargrove! The old man moved. 7 minutes later, Lucien was on horseback in the palace courtyard. A black mare, 16 hands, bred for speed and built for the kind of riding that broke lesser animals. He wore his traveling coat. A pistol sat in his belt. A second was strapped to the saddle. The December night was bitter, the air so cold it burned the inside of his throat with every breath. He kicked the horse into a gallop before the gate was fully open. London blurred past. Gas lamps and dark windows and the empty streets of a city sleeping through a crisis it did not yet understand. Lucian rode north through Islington, through Finsbury, through the sprawling outskirts where the city gave way to countryside, and the road turned from cobblestone to packed earth to frozen mud that cracked beneath the mare's hooves like breaking bones. He rode for 6 hours. He did not stop, not to rest the horse, not to rest himself. Not when the cold ate through his gloves and turned his fingers into rigid claws on the reins. Not when the mare's breathing became labored and foam gathered at her mouth and her stride shortened from exhaustion. He pushed her because time was a finite resource, and the 14 riders following Seraphina's carriage had a 12-hour head start, and the mathematics of distance and speed were not in his favor, and mathematics was the one language Lucian had always trusted to tell the truth. The mathematics said he would arrive too late. He rode faster. At dawn, the landscape changed. The flat agricultural plains of the Midlands gave way to the rolling hills of Yorkshire, frosted white under a sky that was slowly lightening from black to the color of old iron. The road narrowed. Stone walls lined the path on both sides, marking boundaries between farms that had been there for centuries. In the distance, the first outlines of the moors appeared, dark and vast and empty. The landscape that had produced the Ravenscar family and shaped their particular brand of stubborn, unforgiving resilience. Lucian knew this road. He had traveled it hundreds of times, first as a boy riding beside his father, later as a young man driving wagons loaded with steel and coal, later still as a duke in an armored carriage surveying territories he intended to own forever. Every bend was familiar, every hill, every stream crossing and stone bridge and isolated farmhouse. Which is why, when he crested the ridge above Thornton Hollow at 6:30 in the morning, he saw the wreckage immediately. The carriage was on its side. It lay in the ditch beside the road like a wounded animal, one wheel still turning slowly in the morning air. The armored panels had been breached. Bullet holes pocked the reinforced doors. The horses were gone, cut free from the harness and scattered. Around the carriage, scattered across 50 yards of frozen road, lay the evidence of violence. Shell casings, torn fabric, a Blackthorn guard's coat, abandoned and dark with blood, boot prints in the frost, dozens of them, overlapping, churning the ground into a record of chaos. Lucien's heart stopped. Not figuratively. For approximately 1.5 seconds, the muscle in his chest ceased to contract, and the world went silent. And he existed in a space between beats where every fear he had ever suppressed and every nightmare he had ever denied converged into a single, crystalline moment of absolute horror. Then his heart restarted, and he was off the horse and running. He reached the carriage in seconds. He wrenched the door open. The interior was empty. Seraphina's leather case lay on the floor, its contents scattered. One of the seat cushions was torn. A dark stain spread across the upholstery that could have been wine or could have been blood. And Lucien placed his hand on it, and it was cold and damp, and when he pulled his fingers back, they were red. Blood. Not much. A wound, not a killing blow. But blood, here, in this carriage, where she had been sitting while 14 riders closed the distance and shattered the night with gunfire. He backed out of the carriage and scanned the road. His training took over. Not the training of a duke or a businessman, but the training he had given himself in his 20s, when he had spent 3 years working the Liverpool docks and the Manchester warehouses and learning to read violence the way his father had read poetry. As a language with syntax and grammar and meaning that could be decoded if you paid attention, the boot prints told a story. The guards had formed a defensive perimeter around the carriage. They had fought. Shell casings indicated sustained gunfire from multiple positions, a coordinated ambush from both sides of the road. The guards had been overwhelmed, not by superior skill, but by superior numbers. 14 against 6. But Serafina was not among the dead. 2 Blackthorn guards lay face down in the ditch. A third was slumped against the stone wall 20 yards east, his rifle still in his hands. The remaining 3 were missing, and Serafina was missing. Taken. The word lodged in Lucian's chest like a bullet that refused to exit. He stood in the middle of the road. The morning light was strengthening. The moors stretched away on both sides, endless and gray and offering no cover and no comfort. His breath came in visible clouds. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from the adrenaline surge of a body that had been pushed past exhaustion and was now operating on chemical reserves designed for exactly this kind of extremity. Think! He forced himself to think. The ambush had happened hours ago, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the darkness was deepest and the guards most fatigued. The attackers had taken Serafina and at least some of the surviving guards. They had not killed everyone, which meant they wanted hostages. Hostages meant negotiation. Negotiation meant time. But where had they taken her? The boot prints led east, off the road, onto the moorland. 14 horses plus however many prisoners, moving across frozen ground that held tracks. Lucian followed the trail on foot, leading his exhausted mare by the reins. The tracks cut across open country for approximately 2 miles before reaching a stream crossing where the water had frozen solid. On the far side, the tracks turned north, toward the coast, toward the ports where a ship could be waiting to take prisoners out of the country entirely, beyond the reach of English law and Blackthorn power. Lucienne mounted the mare. She protested. He did not care. He kicked her forward and followed the trail at the fastest pace the animal could sustain. The tracks led to a farmstead, an old stone building, abandoned for years by the look of it, sitting in a shallow valley between 2 hills. Smoke rose from the chimney. Horses were tethered in the yard, 14 of them, exactly as intelligence had predicted. 2 men stood guard at the front entrance, rifles slung across their shoulders, stamping their feet against the cold. Lucien dismounted 300 yards out, behind the crest of the eastern hill. He tied the mare to a fence post and drew his pistol. The weapon was a Webley revolver, 6 rounds, effective range 50 yards. Against 14 men with rifles, 6 rounds was mathematics that did not favor survival. He did not care about mathematics anymore. He cared about the woman inside that building. He moved along the hill crest, keeping below the skyline, until he reached a position above the rear of the farmstead. A third guard stood at the back door smoking a cigarette. The smoke rose straight up in the still morning air, marking his position with the precision of a signal flag. Lucien calculated. 3 guards visible, 11 men inside. Serafina somewhere among them. 6 rounds. No reinforcements, no backup. The rider he had sent to warn her had obviously arrived too late or not at all. He was alone. The word had a different weight now than it had carried 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, alone was his natural state, the condition he had cultivated and defended and weaponized for 20 years. Alone meant self-sufficient. Alone meant invulnerable. Alone meant no one could betray you because no one was close enough to reach the knife. Now alone meant Serafina was in that building and he was out here, and the distance between them was filled with armed men, and the only tool he had to close that distance was a revolver with 6 rounds and a body that had not slept in 36 hours, and a mind that was operating at the intersection of exhaustion and terror, and the kind of love that does not make you gentle. It makes you lethal. He moved. The rear guard died quietly. Lucian came from above, dropping from the stone wall that ran along the back of the property, and drove his forearm across the man's throat before the cigarette hit the ground. No gunshot. No noise. Just the mechanical application of force to a vulnerable anatomy by a man who had learned close quarters. Violence in the same Liverpool dockyards where he had learned to read the language of brutality. He took the guard's rifle. Now he had a rifle and a pistol with 6 rounds. Better mathematics, still terrible. He entered through the back door. The interior of the farmstead was a single large room divided by a half-collapsed partition wall. Firelight from the hearth threw moving shadows across stone floors and rough timber beams. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed men and something else, the metallic undertone of blood that told him someone inside was wounded. He heard voices. She has not spoken since we brought her in. Not a word. The men are getting nervous. Let them be nervous. We hold her until Lady Pemberton sends the terms. That is the job. And if Ravenscar comes? Ravenscar is in London, 200 miles south. By the time he knows what happened, we will be on a ship to France. Lucien moved along the wall toward the partition. Through a gap in the collapsed stonework, he could see the main room. 8 men sat around a rough wooden table, playing cards, cleaning weapons, passing a bottle of whiskey. 3 more stood near the fireplace. The remaining 2 were positioned near the front door, watching the road through gaps in the boarded windows. And in the corner, on the floor, hands bound behind her back, sat Serafina. Her face was bruised. A cut ran along her left cheekbone where something, a rifle butt or a fist, had struck her during the ambush. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come loose and hung across her face in dark strands matted with dried blood. But her eyes were open, and they were not afraid. They were furious. The same incandescent, defiant fury he had seen the first night they met, when she had held his stare across a ballroom full of predators and refused to look away. The fury of a woman who had been taken by force and was sitting on a cold stone floor, cataloging every face in the room and committing each one to the memory that would eventually, inevitably, be used to destroy them. Lucien felt something shift in his chest. Not a crack this time, not a fracture, a settling. The feeling of a foundation that had been tested to its limits and had held. She was alive. She was hurt, but alive. And the fact of her aliveness, the biological reality of her heart still beating and her lungs still drawing air and her eyes still burning with that magnificent, ungovernable rage, reorganized every priority in his body around a single objective. Get her out. Everything else was secondary. He counted the positions. 13 men visible. The 14th was the one he had already eliminated outside. 8 at the table, 3 at the fireplace, 2 at the windows. The nearest man was 6 feet from the partition, sitting with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees. 6 rounds in the pistol. Approximately 15 rounds in the stolen rifle. 21 total against 13 targets in an enclosed space. Survivable. Barely. If every shot counted and the element of surprise held for the first 3 seconds. 3 seconds. That was the window. After 3 seconds, return fire would begin and the mathematics would collapse. He raised the rifle. He breathed in. He thought about his father reading poetry in a library that smelled of old books in winter. He thought about his mother writing his name beside wildflowers in the margins. He thought about Serafina holding the hand of a dying man in a Sheffield warehouse and asking for his wife's name. He thought about the word home, spoken inside a carriage by a woman who had not had one for 10 years. He breathed out. He fired. The first round took the nearest man through the back of the skull. The second and third hit 2 of the men at the table before anyone understood what was happening. The fourth clipped the shoulder of a man reaching for his rifle and sent him spinning into the fireplace. By the time Lucien had transitioned from the rifle to the pistol, 4 seconds had passed and the room had erupted into a chaos of screaming men and overturned furniture and the deafening percussion of gunfire in an enclosed space. A bullet struck the partition wall inches from his head. Stone fragments cut his face. He fired twice through the gap, hitting a man who had dropped behind the table and was trying to aim a pistol beneath it. The man folded, 5 down, 8 left. Lucien moved. He came through the partition doorway low and fast, the way you move in close quarters when standing up means dying. A man lunged at him from the right. Lucien drove the butt of the rifle into his face and felt bone give way beneath the impact. 7 left. Another man fired from across the room. The shot went wide, hitting the ceiling beam above Lucien's head and showering him with dust and splinters. Lucien put a pistol round through the man's chest. 6 left. The remaining men had recovered from the initial shock and were organizing. 2 took cover behind the overturned table. 2 more positioned themselves near the front door. The last 2 moved toward Serafina. Whether to use her as a shield or to kill her, Lucien could not tell and did not intend to find out. He dropped the empty rifle and moved with the kind of speed that came not from training or technique, but from the primordial. bone-deep fury of a man who could see the woman he loved in the hands of men who intended to harm her. The first man reaching for Serafina turned just in time to see Lucian's fist connect with his jaw. The impact was not elegant. It was the raw, unscientific violence of a body operating beyond the limits of calculated restraint. The man's head snapped sideways and he dropped. The second man swung a rifle like a club. Lucian caught the barrel with his left hand, felt the metal bite into his palm, and the bones in his fingers scream, and ripped the weapon out of the man's grip with a wrenching motion that dislocated his own shoulder but left him holding the rifle. He reversed the weapon and drove the stock into the man's sternum. The man collapsed. 4 left. Pain flooded Lucian's left shoulder. The dislocated joint sent signals of damage so intense that his vision narrowed and the edges of the room went gray. He could feel blood running from the cuts on his face, mixing with sweat, dripping onto the stone floor. His right hand, the one holding the pistol, was shaking. 2 rounds left. The 2 men behind the table opened fire. Bullets tore through the space around him. One caught the fabric of his coat at the waist, missing flesh by a margin so thin it existed only in the statistical territory of luck. And Lucian had never believed in luck. He believed in preparation and violence and the absolute refusal to die before the job was finished. He fired his 5th round. It hit one of the men behind the table in the throat. The man went down making sounds that no living thing should make. 3 left, 1 round. The 2 men at the door were moving toward him now, spreading apart, creating angles that would make it impossible to cover both simultaneously. The third man, the one behind the table, was reloading his rifle with hands that shook but functioned. Lucian looked at Serafina. She was already moving. While the firefight raged, she had been working her bound hands against a nail protruding from the wall behind her. The rope was fraying. As Lucian watched, she wrenched her wrists apart and the binding snapped. She lunged for the fallen rifle beside the man Lucian had struck in the sternum. She came up with the weapon in her hands, and the look on her face was not the expression of a woman rescued. It was the expression of a woman who had been waiting for an opening and had found one and was fully prepared to use it with the same ruthless precision she brought to everything else. She fired once. The man reloading behind the table jerked backward and did not move again. 2 left. The remaining men looked at each other. They looked at the Duke of Blackthorn standing in the center of the room with blood running down his face and one arm hanging wrong and a pistol in his hand with 1 round remaining. They looked at the woman beside him, unbound, armed, and radiating a fury that made the air itself feel dangerous. They ran. They dropped their weapons and bolted for the front door and disappeared into the Yorkshire morning like men who had suddenly remembered that the job they had been hired for did not pay enough to die over. Lucian let them go. His body made the decision. His legs buckled and he went down on one knee, the pistol clattering to the stone floor. His dislocated shoulder sending waves of nausea through his torso that turned the room into a tilting, spinning collection of shapes and shadows. Serafina was beside him in seconds. She dropped the rifle and caught him before he fell forward. Her hands, still raw from the rope burns, gripped his coat and held him upright. Lucian, stay with me. I am here. Ishki. Your shoulder. Dislocated, not broken. I have had worse. You have not had worse. You look like you fought a building, and the building won. The building had 13 men with rifles. I am declaring it a draw. Bours. Murchet. Something between a laugh and a sob escaped her throat. She pressed her forehead against his. Her skin was cold. His was burning. Between them, in the space where their breath mixed, the reality of what had just happened began to settle. He had ridden 200 miles through the night. He had tracked 14 riders across frozen moorland. He had entered a room full of armed men with 6 rounds and a body running on nothing but terror and love and the stubborn, irrational refusal to let the world take one more person from him. And she had freed herself and picked up a rifle and shot a man with the calm precision of someone who had decided long ago that survival was not something you waited for someone else to provide. They had saved each other. Not the way it happened in stories, not one rescuing the other. Both of them fighting from opposite sides of the same room, converging on the same objective through different paths, meeting in the middle with blood on their hands and fury in their eyes and the absolute, unshakable certainty that neither of them would ever face the darkness alone again. We need to move, she said. The 2 who ran will report back. To Lady Pemberton. You know, Voss decoded it. The entire secondary network. Lady Pemberton has been running Hatch's operation since before his arrest. She used your father's memoirs as the cipher key. Seraphina's face went still. The information hit her the way information of that magnitude always hits. Not as an explosion, but as a subsidence. The ground beneath a fundamental assumption giving way, slowly, irreversibly, revealing a depth of cruelty she had not mapped, because she had not imagined anyone would use her father's own words as the instrument of continued oppression. She will answer for that, Seraphina said. Her voice was level, quiet. The kind of quiet that Lucien recognized because it was his own. The quiet that preceded the most decisive action. She will. Not through Parliament, not through the press. Personally. Personally. They looked at each other. Two people kneeling on the stone floor of a farmhouse surrounded by the aftermath of violence, bleeding, exhausted, damaged in ways that would take months to heal and in ways that would never heal entirely. And in the space between their eyes, a pact was sealed that required no words because it had been written in everything they had done since the night they met. The people who had destroyed their families would be held accountable, not by the system, by them. 3 weeks later, Lady Pemberton was arrested in her Mayfair drawing room. Lucien did not send guards. He did not send constables. He went himself, with Seraphina beside him, and they walked into the Pemberton household at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning while Lady Pemberton was having breakfast. She looked up from her tea when they entered. Her face was perfectly composed, the kind of composure that comes from decades of practice at maintaining an acceptable surface while the machinery beneath it processes information at speeds that would alarm the people who mistake stillness for innocence. Duke Ravenscar, Lady Vale, to what do I owe this unexpected visit? Your network is dismantled, Lucien said. Voss decoded the secondary cipher. Every communication you have sent in the past 18 months is in our possession. The intermediaries you used have been identified and are cooperating. And the men you sent to ambush Lady Vale's carriage are currently providing detailed testimony about who hired them, how they were paid, and where the instructions originated. Lady Pemberton set down her teacup. I see. You used Marcus Vale's memoirs as your cipher key, his private writings. The words of a man you helped destroy, turned into the tool for your continued operations. I want you to understand that I know this, and I want you to understand what it means. What does it mean, Your Grace? Seraphina stepped forward. It means you are not simply a criminal. You are a monument to the specific kind of cruelty that treats human beings as raw material. You used my father's words the way you used his reputation and his freedom and his life, as a resource to be extracted and discarded. And you did it for 30 years without remorse because remorse would have required you to recognize that the people you destroyed were real. Lady Pemberton looked at her. The composure held, but something shifted behind her eyes. Not guilt, not fear, recognition. The recognition of one strategic intelligence by another across the gap between the woman who had built a shadow empire and the woman who had torn it down. Your father was a good man, Lady Pemberton said. That was the problem. Good men are predictable. They follow rules. They trust institutions. They believe in the system. And the system, my dear, has never been designed to protect good men. It has been designed to consume them. I simply operated the machinery. You did not simply operate it. You designed half of it. Someone had to. Your father's generation believed that progress would come through reform, through patience, through working within the framework. They were wrong. The framework was built by people like me, for people like me. And every reformer who walked into it believing he could change it from within was consumed by it exactly as intended. Including my father. Including your father, including Lord Ravenscar, including every idealist who mistook the appearance of fairness for its reality. And you feel nothing. I feel that I played the game as it was designed to be played, and I played it well. If that makes me a monster, then the system that rewarded me for 30 years is the creator of monsters. And I notice that you have not dismantled the system. You have only dismantled me. Seraphina stared at her. She is right, Lucien said quietly. Both women looked at him. Removing Lady Pemberton removes an operator. It does not remove the operating conditions. The system that allowed her to function, that rewarded her cruelty, that consumed my parents and yours, that system is still standing, and it will produce another Lady Pemberton within a decade unless the architecture itself is changed. And you intend to change it. I intend to begin. Lady Pemberton was escorted from her home by Blackthorn guards. She went quietly. She did not protest or plead or attempt to negotiate. She walked to the carriage, waiting at the curb, with the measured dignity of a woman who had always known this moment was possible and had considered it an acceptable risk. At the carriage door, she paused. "One question, Your Grace." "Ask." "Was it worth it? The vengeance, the empire, the 20 years you spent building a weapon to aim at people like me? Looking at you now, standing in my doorway with that woman beside you and those scars on your face and that look in your eyes that tells me you have not slept properly in weeks. Was it worth the price you paid?" Lucien looked at her for a long time. "Ask me in 10 years, he said. "I am still paying." The carriage door closed. The horses pulled away. Lady Pemberton disappeared down the Mayfair street and out of their lives, though not out of history. Her trial would dominate the newspapers for months. The evidence would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. The names of every official, every banker, every lord who had participated would become public record, and the political landscape of England would shift in ways that no one standing on that Tuesday morning could fully predict. But that was the future. The present was Lucien and Seraphina standing on the steps of the Pemberton house, watching the carriage turn the corner, breathing the cold London air that tasted of coal smoke and wet stone, and the particular flavor of a city that had been shaken to its foundations and was still standing. "It is over," Seraphina said. "The dismantling is over. The building has not started." "What building, Matt?" Lucien turned to her. The morning light caught his face. The cuts from the farmhouse fight had scabbed over but would scar. His left arm was still in a sling from the dislocated shoulder. His eyes carried the permanent alteration of a man who had been broken open and reconstructed around a different center of gravity. "My father built schools," he said. "Before they destroyed him, he built schools in the north. He improved factory conditions. He treated workers like human beings. He believed that wealth carried obligation and power carried responsibility. They killed him for it. And I spent 20 years dismantling everything he believed because I decided his beliefs were what got him killed. They were. No. What got him killed was believing those things alone, without protection, without power sufficient to defend the belief. He was right about the obligation. He was wrong about the method. He thought goodness was its own shield. It is not. Goodness without strength is a meal waiting to be consumed." He paused. "But strength without goodness is just machinery. Lady Pemberton proved that. Hatch proved that. 30 years of machinery that consumed everyone it touched and produced nothing except more machinery. So what do you build? Both. Strength and obligation. Power and responsibility. An empire that protects the people inside it instead of consuming them. Not because they are useful, because they are real. That is your father's philosophy. That is my father's philosophy, defended by my mother's son. The son who learned that idealism without force is suicide, and force without idealism is just another version of Hatch. The balance is the thing. The balance is what they killed him for trying to find. And the balance is what I intend to build. Seraphina studied him. The morning light. The scars. The sling. The eyes that had changed so fundamentally in 6 weeks that the man she had met at the Ashworth ball was almost unrecognizable in the man standing beside her now. Not softer, not gentler, recalibrated. A weapon that had discovered it could also be a tool, a fortress that had learned it could also be a home. "You cannot do it alone," she said. "I know. You cannot do it by command. The moment you try to impose this from above, you become the thing you replaced. I know that too. Then how? By asking instead of ordering. By building instead of acquiring, by trusting people who have earned it and accepting that some of them will betray me and surviving the betrayal and trusting again because the alternative is Hatch's world. A world where no one trusts anyone and everyone is alone, and the only power that matters is the power to destroy." He held out his hand, not as a duke extends his hand, not as a commander, not as the Iron Duke whose name made ministers lower their voices and generals reconsider their positions. As a man, scarred and tired and imperfect, and standing on the steps of his enemy's house, offering the only thing he had that could not be forged or purchased or seized by force: himself. Serafina took his hand. Her grip was strong, her fingers interlaced with his. The contact was not gentle. It was the grip of two people who had held each other upright through fire and betrayal and the systematic destruction of everything they thought they knew about how the world worked, and who had discovered in the wreckage that the most resilient structure is not the one that cannot be broken, but the one that can be broken and rebuilt and broken again and rebuilt again. Each time stronger, each time incorporating the knowledge of its own fragility into the architecture of its strength. They walked down the steps together. The carriage waited at the curb. Not the armored carriage, an ordinary one, open to the street and the city and the cold December air that carried the sounds of London, waking up to a morning that looked like every other morning, but was not. Lucien helped Serafina in. She did not need help. She accepted it anyway, because accepting help from someone you trusted was not weakness. It was the architecture of partnership. He climbed in beside her. "Where to, Your Grace?" the driver called. Lucien looked at Serafina. "Home," she said, and the carriage rolled north. Months passed. The trials dominated the press. Hatch was convicted on 37 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. He received a sentence that would keep him in prison until he died, which, given his age, would not be long. Lady Pemberton's trial was more sensational. The revelation that a woman had operated the deepest layer of a criminal conspiracy for 3 decades shattered assumptions about who wielded power in English society and forced a reckoning that extended far beyond the courtroom. Waverley cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Pemberton cooperated because his wife's arrest had destroyed every alliance he possessed, and cooperation was the only card he had left to play. One by one, the nodes of the network were identified, tried, and sentenced. The process was imperfect. Some men escaped accountability through wealth or connections or the structural advantages that the system still provided to people who knew how to exploit it. But the system itself was damaged, cracked, exposed to daylight for the first time in a generation. And in the North, Blackthorn was rebuilding. Not just the steelworks, not just the infrastructure, the philosophy. Lucien established a workers' council at every Blackthorn facility, not as decoration, as governance. Elected representatives with actual authority over conditions, wages, and safety protocols. The first time a council overruled one of his decisions, a cost-cutting measure that would have reduced ventilation in a coal mine, Lucien stood in the council chamber and listened to a miner named William Garrett explain why the measure would kill people. Garrett was nervous. He was a working man speaking to a duke. His hands shook. His voice cracked. But he spoke anyway, because the council structure gave him the standing to speak and the protection to speak truthfully. Lucien listened for 15 minutes without interrupting. Then he rescinded the measure. Hargrove, who had accompanied him, said nothing until they were in the carriage heading back to the keep. "Your father would have made the same decision, Your Grace." "My father did make the same decision, 25 years ago, in the same mine, about the same ventilation system. The difference is that this time, the decision will survive because it was made by a council with authority, not a duke with goodwill. Goodwill dies with the person who carries it. Authority embedded in structure outlives everyone." Hargrove nodded. In 40 years of service, he had never seen a Ravenscar change. He had seen them harden, he had seen them break, yet he had seen them die. But he had never seen one look at the wreckage of everything they believed and choose to build something different from the rubble. Until now. Spring came to the northern moors with the slow, grudging beauty of a landscape that did not believe in announcing itself. The frost retreated. The heather began its long march toward purple. The streams that fed the valleys below Ravenscar Keep ran high with snowmelt, and the sound of moving water filled the air around the old stone fortress that had sheltered the Ravenscar family for 2 centuries and was now sheltering something it had never contained before: a partnership. Serafina had taken over Blackthorn's Northern Education Initiative. She established schools in every town that hosted a Blackthorn facility, funded by a percentage of operational profits that Lucien had written into the company charter as a permanent obligation. The schools taught reading, mathematics, science, and, at Serafina's insistence, political literacy. She wanted the children of factory workers to understand how the system worked, not so they could serve it, so they could change it. The first class graduated in April, 47 children. The ceremony was held in the rebuilt Sheffield Steelworks in the main foundry, on the same ground where 10 men had died 6 months earlier. Lucian stood at the back of the room and watched Serafina hand certificates to children whose parents worked the furnaces he owned. And he felt something in his chest that was not pride and not grief, and not the cold strategic satisfaction of a plan executed successfully. It was the feeling of a man standing inside a future he had not known how to want until someone showed him it was possible. After the ceremony, they walked along the ridge above Sheffield. The city spread below them, gray and smoking, and alive in the way that industrial cities are alive, with the relentless, grinding energy of people building things and breaking things and building them again. Thomas Bright's wife had a daughter, Serafina said. Margaret named her Eleanor. Lucian stopped walking. Eleanor, his mother's name. She did not know the significance, Serafina said. I did not tell her. She chose it because she liked the sound. Lucy N. stood on the ridge above Sheffield and looked down at the city that his family's wealth had built and his enemies had tried to destroy, and his choices were now rebuilding in a different image. The wind came off the moors carrying the smell of heather and peat and the distant, clean scent of the sea. Eleanor, he said, one word. His mother's name. Spoken on a hillside above a city that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be something other than a machine. Serafina stood beside him, not touching, close enough that their shadows merged on the ground into a single shape. What are you thinking? She asked. Lucian was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the heather. Below them, the steelworks hummed with the sound of industry returning to life. I am thinking that my father was right, and that being right was not enough, and that what my mother wrote in the margin of that book, about her boy being stronger than all of them, was not about the kind of strength I spent 20 years building. She meant this, the strength to fail and to stay, to be betrayed and to trust again, to lose and to build anyway. Not because the world deserves it, because the alternative is a world where no one builds anything except walls. He turned to her. I am thinking that I spent 20 years becoming a weapon because I believed weapons were the only thing that survived. And then you walked into my fortress and showed me that the thing I was protecting was an empty room, and the thing worth building was standing right in front of me, throwing inkwells at my grandfather's portrait. Serafina's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something warmer and more complicated. The expression of a woman who had spent 10 years learning to survive alone and had discovered that survival was not the same thing as living, and that the difference between them was precisely one person. Your grandfather's expression still irritates me, she said. He irritated everyone. Then we agree on that at least. Oh, we agree on more than that, like that. He reached for her hand. She gave it. The contact was familiar now, not the desperate grip of two people clinging to each other in the dark. The easy, practiced connection of two people who had learned that holding on was not about fear. It was about choice. They stood on the ridge above Sheffield while the afternoon light stretched across the moors, and the city below them worked and breathed and rebuilt itself with the stubborn, imperfect persistence of people who had decided that the future was worth the trouble of constructing. Behind them, Ravenscar Keep rose against the northern sky. Stone walls 8 feet thick, built to withstand sieges. But the gates were open now, had been open since December. Since the night a man who had spent his life building fortresses discovered that the most dangerous, the most terrifying, the most completely ungovernable act a human being could commit was not the accumulation of power. It was the decision to share it. Lucian and Serafina walked back toward the keep. The heather moved around their ankles. The wind carried the sound of the steelworks and the distant laughter of children leaving the new school and the river running high with spring water over ancient stones. They did not look back. There was nothing behind them that mattered more than what lay ahead. And what lay ahead was not a story about a duke who conquered the world. It was a story about a man who learned, at the cost of everything he believed and nearly everything he loved, that the world could not be conquered, only built, only shared, only held, with open hands, in the full and terrifying knowledge that anything worth keeping was worth the risk of losing. And Lucian Ravenscar, the Iron Duke, the man who had once declared that power was taken and never given, walked through the open gates of his fortress beside the woman who had taught him that the strongest thing a man could do was not to close his fist. It was to open it